Imagine standing where a king once stood 4,000 years ago and realizing he understood something about the universe that we still haven't figured out. That's Egypt. Not the postcards, not the camel rides and gift shops. The real Egypt, the one buried under all of that, where civilization aligned entire monuments to the stars with an accuracy that shouldn't have been possible without our instruments, our math, our machines. They didn't have any of that. And yet, every answer we found has opened 3 new questions. Every tomb we've sealed shut on paper has cracked back open in someone's mind at 2 a.m. So let's ask the questions nobody's fully answered. In a glass case in a museum thousands of miles from the Nile, a small clay tablet sits under careful light. Its surface is covered in wedge-shaped script, cuneiform, the writing of ancient Anatolia, not Egypt. And yet historians believe the words it preserves were once spoken, or perhaps dictated, by an Egyptian queen. Her name was Ankhesenamun. Her plea, if the tablet is to be believed, was extraordinary. "Send me one of your sons, and I will make him my husband. I will never take a servant of mine and make him my husband." The year was around 1323 BC. The pharaoh had just died. Ankhesenamun was the widow of Tutankhamun, daughter of Nefertiti, granddaughter of a dynasty that had shaken Egypt to its foundations with religious revolution. She had already lived through more upheaval than most queens would see in a lifetime. Now, with her husband gone and no male heir to the throne, she found herself in a position with no precedent. Egyptian queens did not marry foreign princes. The throne did not pass to outsiders. And yet, according to Hittite records unearthed in the ruins of Hattusa, that is exactly what she asked for. The Hittite king, Suppiluliuma Serge, was suspicious at first. He sent an envoy to verify the request. Was this a trick? Was there truly no successor waiting in the wings? The queen wrote again, her words, as recorded in the Hittite annals, carrying a note of desperation. "I have not written to any other country, only to you. They say you have many sons. Give me one of your sons, and he will become my husband." Eventually, a Hittite prince named Zannanza was sent toward Egypt. He never arrived. The Hittite records say only that he died on the way. No further explanation, no details of illness or ambush. And here is where the historical trail, already thin, disappears almost entirely. Ankhesenamun, the queen who had reached beyond her own borders in what may have been an act of political desperation or personal survival, vanishes from the record at nearly the same moment. What happened to her? The mainstream explanation offered by many Egyptologists is straightforward, if unsatisfying. Royal successions were often followed by the quiet erasure of inconvenient figures. An elder statesman and possibly Ankhesenamun's own grandfather or great-uncle ascended the throne after Tutankhamun's death. Some evidence, a ring bearing both their names, suggests Ankhesenamun may have briefly been married to Ai himself, perhaps to legitimize his claim to power. After that, nothing. No tomb confirmed as hers. No mummy identified with certainty. No further inscriptions. Was she quietly removed from power once she was no longer useful? Did political enemies see her Hittite letters as an act of treason against Egypt itself? Or did she simply fade into obscurity, living out her remaining years stripped of influence, her name deliberately left off monuments by those who followed? More speculative theories reach further. Some point to skeletal remains found in tombs near the Valley of the Kings, KV-21 in particular, where 2 unidentified female mummies rest without inscriptions to name them. Could one be Ankhesenamun? DNA testing has been inconclusive, hampered by the degraded state of the remains and the lack of confirmed reference samples. Others have speculated, without solid evidence, that her fate was tied to a cover-up surrounding Zannanza's death, that someone in the Egyptian court did not want that marriage to happen and acted to prevent it by any means necessary. We may never know which of these is closer to the truth. What remains is a queen who once reached across an empire's borders in a moment of crisis, and a silence that followed her ever since. Somewhere in that silence is an answer. We simply haven't found it yet. Somewhere along the trade routes of northern Syria, in territory once contested between two of the ancient world's great powers, a road disappears into the hills. The kind of road that would have carried messengers, merchants, and, in the autumn of 1322 BC, a Hittite prince riding toward a throne that was not his own. We left Ankhesenamun in silence, her fate swallowed by the record. But her story does not end with her. It ends, in a sense, before it even had the chance to begin. On a journey undertaken by a young man she likely never met in person, a prince named Zannanza, son of the Hittite king Suppiluliuma, Surs. He was sent in response to a queen's plea. Egypt needed a king, and Ankhesenamun, unwilling to marry a subject and unable to rule alone, had reached across a border rarely crossed by royal marriage. Suppiluliuma, wary but intrigued, dispatched his son toward the Egyptian court. Zannanza never arrived. The account comes to us secondhand, filtered through grief. Suppiluliuma's own scribes recorded his reaction in what is now called the Plague Prayers of Mursili, texts written years later by Zannanza's brother, Mursili II, who ascended the throne after his father's death and struggled to understand why the gods had turned against the Hittite people. In these prayers, Mursili recalls his father's fury and sorrow upon learning that his son had died en route to Egypt. The language is brief, almost clipped, as though the wound was still too raw for elaboration. There is no description of an ambush, no account of illness, no named culprit. Only the bare fact. The prince set out, and the prince did not come back. What killed him? The most straightforward explanation offered by historians is also the least dramatic. Travel in the ancient Near East was dangerous under the best of circumstances. Disease moved quickly along trade routes. Bandits operated in the borderlands between empires where no single authority held firm control. A young man crossing hundreds of miles of contested territory in the 14th century BC faced a dozen ordinary ways to die before ever reaching the Nile. Perhaps that is all this was. Not a conspiracy, but a tragedy of the road, the kind that claimed travelers whose names never made it into any record at all. And yet questions remain, because the timing is difficult to ignore. Zannanza was not simply a traveler. He was a political instrument, the answer to an unprecedented request from an Egyptian queen, a young man whose arrival in Egypt would have fused two of the era's most powerful kingdoms through marriage. That kind of union would have reshaped the balance of power across the entire eastern Mediterranean and the lands stretching toward the Euphrates. Not everyone would have welcomed that outcome. Who, exactly, stood to lose? Within the Egyptian court, the aging official A held enormous influence, having served under multiple pharaohs and positioned himself as a stabilizing hand during Tutankhamun's reign and its uncertain aftermath. When the throne passed to a new ruler following Tutankhamun's death, it was A who claimed it. Not a Hittite prince, not a foreign bloodline, but a man already deeply entrenched in Egyptian power structures. Some historians have speculated cautiously that factions within the Egyptian military or priesthood may have viewed a Hittite king on the throne of Egypt as an intolerable prospect, a threat to both tradition and their own influence. Could word have been sent ahead? Could Zannanza's route have been anticipated and his death arranged before he ever crossed into Egyptian-controlled territory? There is no direct evidence for this. No confession, no accusation preserved in any surviving text, no Egyptian record even acknowledging the episode at all, which is itself part of what makes the mystery so persistent. Egypt's own scribes are silent on the matter entirely. Everything we know comes from the Hittite side, from a grieving father and a son writing decades later, trying to make sense of the plague he believed had been sent as punishment for his father's subsequent war against Egypt in retaliation. That retaliation is worth pausing on. Whatever the cause of Zannanza's death, Suppiluliuma treated it as an act of Egyptian betrayal. He launched a military campaign against Egyptian-held territory in the region, a war that some scholars argue may have brought captured soldiers, and with them, disease, back into Hittite lands, contributing to the very plague Mursili later lamented in his prayers. If true, it means a single death on a lonely road may have set in motion consequences that reshape the region for a generation. Other theories drift further from the center. Some have wondered whether Zannanza's death was never intended as an act of political sabotage at all, but rather the result of internal Hittite rivalries. A prince eliminated by those within his own court who opposed the alliance for reasons lost to us now. Others suggest simple geography sealed his fate. The routes north of Egypt cut through regions loyal to shifting allegiances, where a Hittite prince, however well escorted, may have simply been in the wrong place at a moment of heightened tension between empires. We are left once again with fragments. A queen's letters, a father's grief recorded by a son years later, a war that followed, and a young man who rode toward a crown he never wore, whose final days are marked only by absence in every account that might have told us more. Was Zannanza's death an accident of a dangerous age, or the first move in a conspiracy that succeeded so completely it left almost no trace at all? The road he traveled has long since disappeared beneath centuries of dust. What happened along it may have disappeared with him. In the archives of Boğazköy, in the hills of central Turkey where the Hittite capital of Hattusa once stood, archaeologists in the early 20th century uncovered tens of thousands of clay tablets. A buried bureaucracy, the correspondence and treaties of an empire that had vanished from memory until the moment German excavators began pulling its records out of the dirt. Among them was a set of documents that would come to be known as the Deeds of Suppiluliuma, and buried within those deeds, a single Egyptian word, transliterated into cuneiform, that has occupied historians for over a century: Dakhamunzu. We have already followed the outline of this story: the widowed queen, the plea for a husband, the prince who died before he ever reached the Nile. But before any of that could happen, someone had to write the letter that started it all, and the identity of that person is not as settled as the narrative often suggests. Dakhamunzu is not a name. It is a title, or more precisely, a Hittite scribe's attempt to render an Egyptian phrase phonetically. Most scholars believe it derives from Amenmesse, meaning the king's wife. The Hittite records never give us her actual name. They give us only her position, transliterated through a foreign ear, filtered through a foreign script, and preserved by a foreign court that had every reason to remember the episode and no particular reason to record the personal details that would let us verify, beyond doubt, exactly who she was. For decades, the dominant assumption placed this queen as Ankhesenamun, widow of Tutankhamun, writing in the chaos following her young husband's death around 1323 BC. It is a clean fit. The timeline works. Egypt's succession crisis at that moment is well documented, and a childless queen with no clear path to the throne makes sense as the author of such a desperate letter. But is it the only possibility? Some historians have proposed an entirely different queen from an entirely different moment. Nefertiti, wife of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, also faced a period of uncertain succession following her husband's death years earlier during the tumultuous Amarna period. If Nefertiti briefly ruled Egypt herself, a theory with its own body of supporting and opposing evidence, she too may have faced a throne without a clear male heir, and she too may have looked beyond Egypt's borders for a solution no Egyptian precedent could offer. Her circumstances, in some readings, fit the letters just as plausibly as Ankhesenamun's. Still others have suggested Meritaten, Nefertiti's daughter, who briefly held prominent titles during the same unstable years, as another candidate for the woman behind Dakhamunzu. Why does this matter? Because the identity of the queen determines the entire shape of the story we tell. If she was Ankhesenamun, this is a tale of a teenage widow, granddaughter of Nefertiti, making a desperate final gambit after burying a husband who died young under his own cloud of unanswered questions. If she was Nefertiti herself, the story becomes something else entirely. A powerful, controversial queen extending her reach even in the final uncertain months of her influence, attempting to secure her legacy through a foreign alliance no Egyptian ruler had dared propose before. The Hittite records, frustratingly, do not resolve this for us. They record the exchange, the suspicion of King Suppiluliuma, the envoy sent to verify the queen's sincerity, and her second letter, sharper, more insistent, chiding the Hittite king for doubting her. Am I lying to you? Do I not have a son? Do you think I would write to a foreign land out of some need to humiliate myself and my country? The tone is unmistakably that of a woman under pressure, defending a decision she knows is unprecedented. But nowhere in these tablets does anyone write her name. Egyptian records, for their part, say nothing at all. No Egyptian document references this correspondence, this proposal, or this crisis. A silence that mirrors the silence surrounding Zannanza's death, and one that has led some researchers to wonder whether the omission was deliberate. A queen's request to install a foreign prince on Egypt's throne would have been a profound break from tradition, perhaps even viewed as an act bordering on treason by later officials eager to erase any trace of it from history. Might Egyptian scribes have chosen never to record what they considered a dangerous and shameful episode? More speculative theories go further still. A handful of researchers have questioned whether the letters describe a fabricated crisis altogether, a diplomatic maneuver crafted by court officials rather than a queen acting alone, using her voice and title as cover for a political strategy aimed at destabilizing the Hittites, or perhaps testing their intentions before a larger conflict. Under this reading, Dakhamunzu becomes less a desperate widow and more a diplomatic instrument. Her true feelings and identity buried beneath layers of court strategy we can no longer fully reconstruct. What we are left with, in the end, is a fragment of a much larger conversation, written in a foreign hand, describing an Egyptian queen who never gives her name. She asks for a husband. She defends her honor. She insists she is telling the truth. And then, without warning, she disappears from the historical record entirely, her identity still argued over by scholars separated from her by more than 3,000 years. Was she Ankhesenamun, reaching for survival in the wreckage of her husband's death? Was she Nefertiti, extending her influence past the boundaries any Egyptian queen had tested before? Or someone else entirely, whose name simply never made it into the surviving fragments of two empires' correspondence? The tablets remain in Hattusa's ruins and in the museum cases that now hold their fragments, still refusing to answer the one question they seem almost designed to raise. A gold signet ring, no larger than a coin, rests in a museum collection far from the tomb where it may once have been worn. Pressed into its surface are two cartouches, side by side, the royal names of Ankhesenamun and a man named Ai, the elder statesman who became pharaoh after Tutankhamun's death. It is a small object to carry so much weight, but for over a century, it has been one of the few physical clues historians have used to try to answer a question the Hittite tablets themselves refuse to settle. We know a queen wrote to the Hittite king. We know she called herself Dakhamunzu, a title rather than a name. What we do not know with certainty is which Egyptian queen stood behind that title, and the search for her true identity has sent historians combing through rings, seals, monuments, and fragmentary inscriptions for anything that might put a face to the woman who tried to reshape Egypt's future. The case for Ankhesenamun begins with timing. Tutankhamun died young, likely in his late teens, leaving no heir. Ankhesenamun, his wife and half-sister, would have found herself exactly where the Hittite letters describe their author, a queen with no son, facing a court eager to install anyone, on the vacant throne. The ring bearing her name alongside A's has led some scholars to conclude that after her attempt to bring in a Hittite prince failed, she was married off to A instead, perhaps to lend legitimacy to his rule, perhaps against her own wishes. If this reading is correct, the ring becomes a kind of epilogue to the letters themselves, physical evidence of what happened after diplomacy failed. But rings can be misleading. Some Egyptologists have questioned whether this ring proves marriage at all, or whether it might instead represent something closer to a political pairing, a symbolic joining of names meant to smooth the transition of power rather than record a personal union. Ancient Egyptian iconography did not always draw the line between political alliance and marital bond as clearly as modern eyes expect it to. Then there is the case for Nefertiti, which rests on a different kind of evidence entirely. Not a ring, but a puzzle of royal names and titles from the final years of the Amarna period. Inscriptions referring to a co-ruler named Neferneferuaten have long puzzled historians, in part because the name appears to belong to a woman, and in part because it may have been used by Nefertiti herself in the years after her husband Akhenaten's death, when Egypt's traditional religious order remained in upheaval and no clear male heir had yet secured the throne. If Nefertiti did rule, even briefly, under this alternate name, she would have faced the same crisis the Dakhamunzu letters describe: a woman on the throne, a kingdom without a prince, and neighboring powers watching closely to see what she would do next. Supporters of this theory point to the timing of Egypt's political instability during the Amarna transition and argue that the boldness of the letters, their willingness to break centuries of tradition, fits more naturally with a queen already accustomed to wielding unprecedented authority, as Nefertiti had during her husband's reign, than with a teenage widow suddenly thrust into crisis. Critics counter that the timeline is difficult to reconcile. The Hittite records tie the correspondence closely to the death of a pharaoh who left no heir, a detail that aligns more comfortably with Tutankhamun's death than with the murkier, still debated final years of Akhenaten's reign. A third candidate lingers at the edges of the debate: Meritaten, daughter of Nefertiti and Akhenaten, who held prominent royal titles during this same unstable window, and whose name appears alongside possible co-regency inscriptions of her own. If she briefly held power, or held influence significant enough to author such a letter, she too becomes a plausible face behind the Hittite title. But the evidence here is thinner still, built more on the absence of contrary proof than on any direct connection to the correspondence itself. What makes this puzzle so resistant to resolution is not a lack of evidence, but its fragmentary and contradictory nature. Egypt's own scribes left no record of the letters at all. The objects that survive, rings, seals, inscribed blocks reused in later construction, were not created to answer questions asked 3,000 years later. They were functional, symbolic, sometimes deliberately ambiguous even in their own time, shaped by the political needs of a court managing a succession crisis in real time, not preserving clarity for future historians. Could new evidence still emerge? Excavations continue across Egypt and Turkey, and tombs once thought fully explored have, in past decades, yielded objects that overturned long-held assumptions. A single inscription, a single sealed chamber, could in theory settle a debate that has persisted for over 100 years. Or the truth may already be sitting in a museum drawer somewhere, unrecognized, waiting for someone to notice a detail no one has yet connected to this story. For now, the queen behind Dakhamunzu remains exactly what the Hittite scribes left her as: a title without a face, a voice without a confirmed name. Was she the young widow of a boy king, reaching for survival? Was she a seasoned ruler extending power she had already claimed? Or was she someone whose name has simply not survived at all, lost between two empires' records and 3,000 years of sand? The ring stays behind its glass. The cartouches remain silent, and the question that has occupied Egyptologists for a century continues, patiently, to wait for its answer. Across the eastern desert plain of modern-day Amarna, wind moves through the remains of a city that existed for barely 15 years before it was deliberately abandoned, its temples dismantled, its name struck from later king lists as though its rulers had never existed at all. This was Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, built from nothing by the pharaoh Akhenaten as the capital of a new religion centered on a single sun disk god. And it was here, within these vanished walls, that an entire royal family seems to have simply dissolved from the historical record, one figure at a time, until almost none of them can be traced with certainty to a tomb, a mummy, or a confirmed fate. We have already followed the threads of individual mysteries within this family. A queen who may have written to the Hittites, a name that may or may not belong to Nefertiti herself. But step back far enough, and a larger, stranger pattern comes into focus. This was not simply one queen's disappearance. It was the quiet erasure of nearly an entire dynasty. Consider the family as it stood at the height of Akhenaten's reign. The pharaoh himself, his primary wife Nefertiti, and at least 6 daughters are depicted repeatedly in Amarna's art, a family portrayed with unusual intimacy for Egyptian royal iconography, shown embracing, playing with their children, sitting together beneath the rays of the Aten. It is some of the most personal royal imagery to survive from ancient Egypt. And then, within a span of roughly 2 decades, nearly every member of that family vanishes from history with no clear explanation. 2 of the daughters, Meketaten and possibly a younger sister, appear to have died during the Amarna period itself. Their deaths recorded in tomb reliefs that some scholars connect to a wave of plague sweeping through the region at the time. A devastating possibility, given that the same disease may later be linked to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma's own death, and to the plague his son Mursili lamented in his prayers. Was Amarna's royal family among the first casualties of an epidemic whose reach extended across the ancient Near East? Then Akhenaten himself disappears from the record, his death undated with precision, his burial place still debated. A tomb was prepared for him at Amarna, but whether his body ever rested there permanently or was later moved during Egypt's return to traditional religion remains unresolved. Some researchers have proposed that a mummy found in tomb KV55 in the Valley of the Kings may be Akhenaten, based on genetic testing suggesting a close relationship to Tutankhamun. Others contest this identification entirely, pointing to inconsistencies in the mummy's estimated age at death and unresolved questions about the DNA analysis itself. Nefertiti's fate is, if anything, even murkier. She appears prominently in Amarna's art through the middle years of the period, then fades from clear depiction in its final years. Did she die during this window alongside her daughters in the same wave of illness? Did she survive her husband and rule Egypt herself briefly under the name Neferneferuaten before vanishing into whatever crisis produced the Dakhamunzu letters? Or did she simply retire from public life, her image no longer commissioned for reasons lost to us, while she lived on in relative obscurity? Each of these theories has serious scholarly support. None has been proven beyond dispute. Even Tutankhamun, the family's most famous member, whose golden burial mask has become perhaps the single most recognizable image of ancient Egypt, still carries unresolved questions about his own parentage. DNA evidence suggests his father was likely Akhenaten, but his mother remains identified only as the younger lady, a mummy whose own identity is far from settled among researchers. And what of the other daughters, Meritaten, Ankhesenamun, and the rest? Some held prominent titles during the transitional years after Akhenaten's death. Others simply stop appearing in inscriptions, their final years, deaths, and burial places entirely unknown. No confirmed tombs, no mummies identified beyond reasonable doubt. A family that once filled the walls of an entire city with images of their daily lives together has left behind almost nothing to mark how, or where, most of them ended. The mainstream explanation offered by many historians points to the sheer political chaos that followed Akhenaten's religious revolution. When Egypt returned to its traditional gods under later rulers, officials moved deliberately to erase the Amarna period from memory, dismantling its monuments, striking its kings from official records, and reusing its building blocks as filler in later construction projects. In this reading, the family's disappearance is not mysterious so much as it is the predictable result of a systematic campaign to bury an uncomfortable chapter of Egyptian history, along with the physical evidence of who was buried where. But others wonder whether the erasure was complete enough to explain everything we don't know. Could tombs belonging to Nefertiti, or to the missing daughters, still lie unexcavated beneath the sands near the Valley of the Kings, or the ruins of Amarna itself? Radar surveys and scans of the region have periodically suggested hidden chambers and unexplored spaces, fueling speculation that continues to circulate among researchers and enthusiasts alike, even as definitive proof remains elusive. An entire family, painted so vividly into the walls of their own city, has left behind a historical record riddled with more gaps than certainties. Did disease claim them one by one? Did political upheaval scatter their fates in different directions? Or are there tombs still out there, sealed and waiting, holding answers that Amarna's sands have kept for over 3,000 years? The wind still moves through what remains of that horizon city. Whatever it once held, it has not yet told us everything. On a fragment of papyrus known as the Turin King List, a document so damaged by time that entire dynasties survive only as gaps and guesses, a name appears between two of ancient Egypt's most secure and well-documented rulers. The name is Userkare, and almost everything about the man who bore it remains even now, essentially unknown. We move now from the vanished family of Amarna, a mystery built on too much evidence pointing in too many directions, to a mystery of the opposite kind entirely. A king so faintly recorded that historians have spent decades simply trying to establish that he existed at all, let alone explain who he was or why he ruled so briefly. Userkare appears in the 6th dynasty, positioned between the reign of Seti, Egypt's first king of that dynasty, and Pepi I, who would go on to rule for decades and leave behind a substantial body of monuments and inscriptions. Seti's reign, by contrast, ends under a cloud of suspicion. Manetho, the Egyptian priest whose later history of Egypt survives only in fragments quoted by other ancient authors, claim that Seti was murdered by his own bodyguards. Modern historians treat this claim cautiously. Manetho wrote over 2,000 years after the events he described, drawing on sources we can no longer verify. But the accusation has never been fully dismissed either, in part because of what happens next in the record. Userkare's reign appears to have lasted somewhere between 1 and 5 years, a startlingly brief interruption between two more firmly established kings. And then Pepi I ascends the throne, Seti's son, restoring what appears to be the intended royal bloodline. The implication, for many Egyptologists, is difficult to avoid. Userkare looks like a usurper, a king who seized power during a moment of crisis, perhaps connected to whatever fate actually befell Seti, only to be pushed aside himself once the rightful heir came of age or gathered sufficient support to reclaim his throne. But this reading, however logical it seems, rests on remarkably little direct evidence. Unlike most Egyptian kings, Userkare left behind no confirmed pyramid, no substantial temple inscriptions, no clear administrative records from his reign. His name survives primarily in later king lists and in the titles of a small number of officials who appear to have served during his brief rule. A handful of seals bearing his name have been found, along with a few scattered references in the tombs of officials who mentioned serving multiple kings across this transitional period. That is nearly the entirety of the physical record. For a ruler of Egypt, however short his reign, this is an extraordinarily thin footprint, thinner than nearly any other confirmed king of the Old Kingdom. Why would a king leave so little behind? The mainstream explanation suggests simple brevity. A reign of only a year or two, especially one born from political crisis rather than stable succession, would have left little time to commission the kind of grand pyramid complex and temple inscriptions that later generations relied on to remember a king's existence. Under this reading, Userkare is not so much erased as he is simply unfinished. A ruler whose short time on the throne never allowed him to build the monuments that preserve most pharaohs in memory. A more deliberate theory suggests something closer to the fate of Akhenaten's family in the aftermath of Amarna: intentional erasure. If Userkare truly did seize power through violence or political maneuvering against Seti's rightful line, later officials under Pepi IV may have had every reason to minimize his memory, omitting him from monuments and limiting his presence to the bare bureaucratic record that could not be entirely erased without disrupting the administrative continuity officials needed to do their jobs. Kings who were viewed as illegitimate were sometimes treated this way in Egyptian history. Their names avoided in favor of later, more acceptable rulers, their reigns folded quietly into the years attributed to their predecessors or successors. Some scholars have gone further still, questioning not just Userkare's legitimacy, but his very origins. Was he a rival claimant from within the royal family, a half-brother or cousin positioning himself against Seti's designated heir? Was he connected to a priesthood or faction opposed to changes Seti may have made during his reign, changes to religious practice, to the balance of power between the crown and Egypt's temple institutions, or to the privileges of officials whose support a king needed to rule securely. The name Userkare itself, meaning roughly, powerful is the soul of Ra, invokes the sun god Ra, rather than the more localized deities favored by Teti's branch of the dynasty, leading some researchers to wonder whether his rise represented a religious or factional shift within the court, rather than simple palace intrigue. None of these theories can be confirmed with the evidence currently available. The sources are too fragmentary, too distant, too filtered through later scribes with their own reasons for remembering, or forgetting, the past accurately. What remains is a name on a damaged papyrus, a handful of seals, and a gap between two better documented kings where an entire reign, however brief, once took place. A man ruled Egypt, commanded its administration, and was addressed by its officials as a living god upon the throne, and almost nothing else about him survived the centuries that followed. Was Userkare a usurper who paid for his ambition with historical erasure? A legitimate ruler simply unlucky enough to reign too briefly to leave a lasting mark? Or evidence of a political and religious struggle at the heart of the Sixth Dynasty that later generations worked deliberately to conceal? The papyrus fragment offers only his name. Everything else, the man, the crisis, the reasons for his disappearance from history, remains buried somewhere beneath 4,500 years of silence. In the Valley of the Kings, in a tomb designated KV-10, the painted walls tell two conflicting stories at once. Carved into the same plaster are the names of two different pharaohs, one image chiseled away and replaced by another, as though the tomb itself could not decide who it belonged to. This is the tomb of Amenmesse, or perhaps, depending on which layer of history you trust, the tomb of someone else entirely, later reused, relabeled, and argued over by scholars for more than a century. From a usurper king whose brief reign left almost nothing behind, we move now to a king whose reign left plenty behind, except clarity. Where Userkare's mystery is one of near total silence, Amenmesse's is a mystery of contradiction, a reign so tangled in competing claims and physical alterations that historians still cannot agree on its most basic facts: how long he ruled, how he came to power, or even in the eyes of some researchers, whether Amenmesse and another figure entirely might be one and the same person. Amenmesse ruled Egypt during the 19th dynasty, in the years following the death of Merneptah, son of the great Ramesses II. By most reconstructions, his reign fell somewhere around 1203 to 1200 BC, a brief interruption between Merneptah's death and the rule of Seti II, who was, by conventional succession, Merneptah's rightful heir. And this is where the trouble begins. If Seti II was the legitimate successor, what was Amenmesse doing on the throne at all? The most widely accepted explanation is that Amenmesse was a usurper, possibly a son of Merneptah by a secondary wife, who seized control of Upper Egypt during a period of contested succession, ruling simultaneously with, or in direct opposition to, Seti II in the north. Egypt, under this reading, was briefly and quietly divided. Two kings claiming legitimacy at the same time, their names appearing on monuments in different regions of the same kingdom, each likely working to erase the other's presence wherever his own authority reached. Evidence for this rivalry survives in an unusually direct form. In several tombs and temples belonging to officials from this period, the name and image of Amenmesse have been deliberately chiseled out and replaced with the name of Seti II, a pattern of erasure that suggests not simple bureaucratic correction, but active political retaliation once Seti II's faction regained full control of the country. Whoever ordered these changes wanted Amenmesse's claim to kingship struck from the record as thoroughly as possible. But why would a king need to erase a rival so aggressively unless that rival had posed a genuine, serious threat to his legitimacy? Some historians have proposed that Amenmesse's rise may not have been a straightforward act of ambition, but a response to real uncertainty in the royal succession. Perhaps Merneptah's intended heir was unclear, or contested among factions within the court, leaving an opening for a secondary claimant to assert power over at least part of the country. Egypt's 19th dynasty was not immune to this kind of instability. The line of succession from Ramesses II onward involved multiple sons, shifting political alliances, and, in the years following Amenmesse's reign, further turmoil that would eventually help usher in the collapse of the dynasty altogether. The mystery deepens further with the question of Amenmesse's tomb itself. KV-10 shows clear evidence of alteration, decoration that appears to have been carved for Amenmesse originally, later damaged or reworked, possibly during the same period of retaliation that struck his name from other monuments. Complicating matters further, a queen's tomb nearby, believed to belong to Amenmesse's mother, Takhat, shows similar signs of alteration and later reuse, raising questions about whether royal women connected to Amenmesse's contested claim were also targeted after his fall from power, their own memory adjusted or diminished alongside his. A more speculative thread in this mystery involves the identity of Amenmesse himself. A handful of researchers have questioned whether Amenmesse might be identical to a figure known from other sources as Messui, a Nubian viceroy who served under Merneptah, suggesting that the usurper king may have built his brief claim to power on a base of support drawn from Egypt's southern territories, where his prior role as viceroy could have provided both the administrative authority and military backing needed to make a bid for the throne. This theory remains contested, resting on circumstantial parallels rather than confirmed documentation connecting the two figures directly. What ended Amenmesse's reign is equally uncertain. Did Seti II defeat him militarily, reclaiming full control of Egypt by force? Did Amenmesse die of natural causes, his brief claim to power collapsing simply because he left no strong enough faction behind to sustain it after his death? Or was he removed through some other means entirely, the details deliberately excluded from a record already dedicated to minimizing his existence? No account survives to answer this directly. The erasures tell us that a conflict happened. They do not tell us how it ended. What we are left with, once again, is a tomb caught between two names, a king whose reign the historical record seems almost engineered to obscure, and a series of physical alterations that speak louder than any surviving text about the political stakes involved. Amenmesse ruled Egypt, however briefly, however contested his claim, and then the very people who succeeded him worked to make certain that as little of his memory as possible would survive. Did his ambition simply exceed his legitimacy, or was he a rightful claimant whose historical erasure was itself the greater injustice? Was his power base built in the south, among officials and soldiers loyal to a Nubian viceroy rather than a distant royal court? And what more might still lie beneath the reworked plaster of KV-10, waiting for a closer examination to reveal what earlier hands tried so deliberately to hide? For now, the walls of that tomb hold two kings at once, and only one clear answer. Someone, long ago, wanted this story told differently than it actually happened. Deep in the West Valley, a lesser-visited branch of the Valley of the Kings, a tomb known as WV-23 lies quiet compared to its more famous neighbors. Its burial chamber holds something unusual for this stretch of the valley. A ceiling painted with rows of golden baboons beneath a deep blue sky, and walls decorated with scenes of the king's journey into the afterlife, executed with the same care given to any legitimate pharaoh's final resting place. And yet the man buried here is one whose very right to be remembered as king was, quite deliberately, called into question by those who came after him. We have already encountered this figure at the edges of an earlier mystery, the elder statesman whose name appears on a ring alongside Ankhesenamun's, the man who claimed Egypt's throne after Tutankhamun's death. His name was Ai, and his reign, brief as it was, sits at the center of one of the more understated erasures in Egyptian royal history. Not the total obliteration inflicted on a heretic like Akhenaten, but something more selective, more careful, as though later generations wanted him diminished rather than destroyed entirely. Ai's origins remain even now imperfectly understood. He held significant influence for decades before ever becoming king, serving as a close advisor through the reigns of Akhenaten and possibly Nefertiti, before rising to prominence once again as the power behind the young Tutankhamun's throne. Some scholars believe he may have been related to Queen Tai, wife of Amenhotep III, which would place him within the royal family's orbit by blood as well as by office, though this connection, like much of his early life, rests on inference rather than direct confirmation. What is clear is that by the time Tutankhamun died young and without an heir, I was perhaps the most powerful non-royal figure in Egypt, positioned as though the throne had been waiting for him for years. And yet his path to that throne is tangled in the very mystery we explored earlier. Ankhesenamun's letters to the Hittites, her plea for a foreign prince, the death of Zannanza on the road to Egypt. If A's rise to power depended on the failure of that marriage, on the queen's alternative plans falling apart before they could be realized, then his reign begins under a shadow that never fully lifted. Was he a stabilizing hand who stepped in only once Ankhesenamun's foreign gambit collapsed? Or did his own ambitions play some part in ensuring that gambit never succeeded in the first place? No source directly connects him to Zannanza's death, but the convenience of the timing has never stopped scholars from asking the question. His reign itself lasted only about 4 years, and monuments from this period show a ruler working carefully to present himself as Tutankhamun's rightful successor, completing his predecessor's burial and funerary rites, a duty traditionally reserved for a legitimate heir, which A was not, at least not by blood. Images from Tutankhamun's tomb depict I performing the opening of the mouth ceremony over the young king's mummy, a ritual act of succession that seems almost designed to assert legitimacy I did not otherwise clearly possess. Then comes the aftermath, and this is where the erasure begins in earnest. Horemheb, the military commander who succeeded I, moved with unmistakable purpose to remove both I and the entire Amarna period from official memory. Later, king lists compiled during subsequent dynasties skip directly from Amenhotep III to Horemheb himself, omitting Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, I, and the brief, uncertain reign of Amenmesse's own era's predecessors entirely, collapsing decades of Egyptian history into a gap as though the intervening kings had simply never ruled at all. Horemheb claimed credit for restoring order to a chaos he attributed to his predecessors, dating his own reign in some records as though it began immediately after Amenhotep III, erasing not just individual monuments, but the very sequence of time itself. I's own monument suffered accordingly. His mortuary temple was dismantled, its materials reused in later construction, its dedication to his memory quietly undone by the very practice of recycling that preserved so much of Egypt's stone, even as it destroyed the context those stones once carried. His cartouches were chiseled from surviving inscriptions in several locations, following the same pattern of retaliatory erasure seen in the aftermath of Amenmesse's contested reign, though whether A's erasure stemmed from Horemheb's personal animosity, from a broader campaign against everything connected to the Amarna period, or from A's own uncertain legitimacy as a non-royal king, remains genuinely unclear. Why erase him so deliberately rather than simply allowing time to do what it does to most minor rulers? Some historians argue Horemheb needed A's reign erased specifically because A represented an uncomfortable precedent, a non-royal official who had successfully claimed the throne through political maneuvering rather than bloodline, a precedent Horemheb himself, no blood relation to the royal family either, may have found it safer to obscure rather than acknowledge as recent history. Others suggest the erasure was less personal and more procedural, part of a broader effort to distance the restored traditional religion from every trace of the Amarna experiment, regardless of which individual king happened to be swept up in that larger campaign. A smaller number of researchers have wondered whether something more specific occurred during A's brief reign. Some decision, some conflict, some association with the still unresolved Hittite affair that made him a genuinely unwelcome figure to remember, beyond simple dynastic housekeeping. No direct evidence supports this more pointed theory, but the thoroughness of his erasure, layered atop the unanswered questions already surrounding his rise to power, has kept the possibility alive in scholarly discussion. What remains is a tomb built with genuine royal care, painted with the same attention given to any legitimate pharaoh, belonging to a man whose name was nearly stripped from history entirely by the ruler who followed him. A reached the throne of Egypt after decades of quiet influence, presided over the burial of the boy king he may have outmaneuvered, and then watched, though of course he did not live to watch it, as the record of his own reign was dismantled piece by piece. Was his erasure a matter of political necessity, or something closer to a lingering, unspoken suspicion about how he had gotten there in the first place? The golden baboons still watch over his burial chamber in the quiet of the West Valley. The walls remember him. Egypt's official history for a long time tried not to. At the Temple of Karnak, among the countless inscriptions layered by generation after generation of pharaohs eager to record their achievements upon its walls, there exists a curious gap in the years surrounding 1200 BC, a silence in a place normally so eager to speak, as though the kings who might have claimed those years found it safer to leave the stone blank than to commit a contested truth to permanent record. Erasure, we have seen, was Egypt's preferred method of managing an uncomfortable past. But erasure only tells us that something happened. It rarely tells us what. And nowhere is that gap between evidence and explanation more frustrating than in the conflict that erupted between two claimants to the same throne at the close of the 19th dynasty. A conflict we have already glimpsed through the chiseled-out cartouches of Amenmesse's tomb, but one that deserves to be examined now on its own terms, as what many historians believe was nothing less than a civil war fought for control of Egypt itself. The two men at the center of this struggle were Seti II, son of Merneptah, and by conventional succession the rightful heir to Egypt's throne, and Amenmesse, whose exact relationship to the royal family remains debated, but who nonetheless managed to seize control of a significant portion of the country during what appears to have been a period of prolonged and genuine political division. The evidence for open conflict, rather than a simple, brief usurpation, comes largely from geography. Monuments and inscriptions bearing Amenmesse's name cluster heavily in Upper Egypt and Nubia, particularly around Thebes, while Seti II's authority appears more firmly rooted in the north. For a period that some historians estimate lasted several years, Egypt may have functioned as two kingdoms wearing the face of one, each ruler claiming full pharaonic legitimacy, each likely dating official documents according to his own reign, each almost certainly regarded by the other as an illegitimate pretender to be removed rather than a rival to be negotiated with. What caused the fracture in the first place? Here the record turns frustratingly quiet, offering us the shape of a conflict without its motive. One widely considered explanation points to succession irregularities following Merneptah's death. Merneptah had already reached an advanced age by the time he took the throne, having outlived his father Ramesses II by only a handful of years before his own death around 1203 BC. If the line of succession from Merneptah to Seti II was not as clean as later records suggest, if rival branches of the royal family saw an opening in the transition, Amenmesse may have represented a genuine alternative claim, backed by supporters within Egypt's southern administration who saw advantage in aligning with a different candidate than the one favored in the north. The involvement of Nubia adds another layer to this puzzle. Egypt's southern territories were governed during this period by a viceroy, and if Amenmesse's connection to a Nubian official named Mesui holds any merit, his power base may have extended deep into Egypt's African territories, giving him access to resources, soldiers, and administrative networks entirely separate from those loyal to Seti II in the Delta and northern regions. A civil war fought along these lines would not simply have been a dispute between two men, but a struggle between two entire regional power structures, each capable of sustaining a rival king for years at a time. Physical evidence of the conflict's intensity survives in the damage done to officials caught on the wrong side of it. Tombs belonging to men who had served under Amenmesse in Thebes show clear evidence of later reworking. Their original decorations altered, their affiliations edited once Seti II's faction regained control of the south, a pattern that mirrors and confirms the earlier chiseling found in Amenmesse's own tomb. These were not abstract political disagreements playing out in royal correspondence. They were consequences visited upon real officials, administrators, and priests whose careers, and possibly their lives, depended on backing the eventual winner. And there was a winner. Seti II's name appears in the historical record following this period with none of the uncertainty that surrounds Amenmesse's, his reign continuing until his own death, after which the throne passed onward through further turbulence toward the eventual rise of the 20th dynasty. Whatever military or political struggle unfolded between these two claimants, it ended with Amenmesse's faction defeated thoroughly enough that his name required active suppression rather than simple neglect. But the details of how that victory was achieved remain almost entirely absent from the record. Was there open military conflict, armies clashing somewhere along the Nile, or did the struggle play out more quietly, through shifting political allegiances and the gradual erosion of Amenmesse's support in the south? Did Amenmesse die in the course of this conflict, or did he simply lose his grip on power and fade from relevance before his natural death? No inscription describes a battle. No account names a victor in the moment of victory. We are left to infer the war's existence almost entirely from its aftermath, from erased names, reworked tombs, and a gap in the record where a fuller account should exist. Some researchers have gone further still, questioning whether civil war is even the right framework for understanding what happened, wondering instead whether this was a more limited, contained rebellion in the south that never seriously threatened Seti II's overall control of Egypt, later remembered with more severity by scholars reconstructing events from fragmentary evidence than the conflict actually merited in its own time. Without a clearer account from either side, the true scale of the struggle, whether it shook the foundations of the 19th dynasty or merely disturbed one region for a few contested years, remains a matter of interpretation rather than settled fact. What Karnak's silence and Thebes' reworked tombs leave behind is the unmistakable residue of conflict, without the narrative that would let us understand its full shape. Two kings ruled the same country at the same time. One of them was erased, and the space between those two facts holds a civil war whose battles, causes, and true scale Egypt's surviving records have never fully agreed to reveal. Beneath the modern city of Luxor, where ancient Thebes once stood as Egypt's religious and administrative heart, archaeologists have long suspected that somewhere in the mud and limestone bedrock lies a resource that could rewrite much of what we think we know about the early New Kingdom. Not gold, not a hidden tomb, but paper. Or rather, its ancient equivalent. Papyrus, the administrative backbone of an empire, and the one category of evidence that has almost entirely failed to survive from the very period historians most need it. We have spent this exploration moving through gaps, erased names, missing tombs, kings reduced to fragments on damaged king lists. But behind nearly every one of these individual mysteries sits a larger, structural problem, one so fundamental that it shapes almost everything we think we know, or fail to know, about this era of Egyptian history: the near-total disappearance of the state's own written archives. Egypt, by the early New Kingdom, was not a society lacking in bureaucracy. Quite the opposite. Temple economies, royal workshops, tax records, legal disputes, diplomatic correspondence, and the daily administration of a growing empire all depended on extensive written documentation, produced continuously by scribes trained specifically for this purpose. We know this administrative culture existed in enormous volume because later periods and certain fortunate pockets of preservation have shown us fragments of what it looked like: legal papyri, temple inventories, the occasional cache of royal letters. The Amarna letters themselves, the diplomatic correspondence that first introduced us to the Dakhamunzu affair, survive only because they were written on clay rather than papyrus, and clay endures in ways that organic material simply does not. And this is the heart of the problem. Papyrus, for all its importance to Egyptian administration, is desperately fragile. It survives well only under very specific conditions: extreme dryness, isolation from moisture and microbial activity, and ideally, total burial away from the kind of settlement and reuse that characterize centers like Thebes and Memphis for thousands of continuous years of habitation. The desert has preserved isolated finds beautifully. Entire towns like Deir el-Medina, home to the workers who built the royal tombs, have yielded rich troves of everyday documents precisely because that settlement sat in dry, undisturbed ground. But the great state archives, the central administrative repositories that would have held the day-to-day records of pharaohs, viziers, and royal courts, sat in cities that never stopped being cities, built over, flooded, farmed, and rebuilt across more than 3,000 years of continuous occupation. What would those archives have told us had they survived? Perhaps everything. A central state archive from the reign of Tutankhamun might have named the queen behind the Dakhamunzu letters beyond any doubt. Administrative records from the transition between Amenmesse and Seti II might have described, in plain bureaucratic language, exactly how that civil war unfolded and who commanded which forces where. Court records from the aftermath of Titi's death might have settled, once and for all, whether Userkare was a usurper, a legitimate transitional ruler, or something else entirely. Instead, we are left reconstructing these events from fragments never intended to serve as historical evidence at all. Tomb inscriptions meant to honor the dead, temple dedications meant to please the gods, king lists compiled generations later for ritual rather than documentary purposes. Some Egyptologists have pointed to specific historical moments that likely accelerated this loss beyond simple organic decay. The end of the Amarna period saw deliberate destruction of religious and administrative material connected to Akhenaten's reign, as later officials worked to erase a chapter of history they considered dangerous or heretical. Periods of civil unrest, like the one that may have divided Seti II's Egypt from Amenmesse's, would have created their own incentives for destroying or falsifying records that documented the losing side's legitimacy. And beyond these targeted moments, the simple accumulation of building, flooding, and rebuilding across Thebes and Memphis over millennia would have ground even accidentally preserved material into dust long before modern archaeology arrived to look for it. Could significant caches still be waiting, somewhere beneath the modern cities that now sit atop these ancient capitals? It is not an idle question. Deir el-Medina's archive remained undiscovered for thousands of years, simply because no one had reason to dig in that particular stretch of desert until relatively recently. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive survey techniques have occasionally hinted at unexplored voids and structures beneath areas of Luxor and other ancient sites, though the practical challenges of excavating beneath a living, modern city are immense, and any papyrus that might exist in such conditions would face enormous risk of destruction the moment it was exposed to open air and modern humidity after thousands of years sealed away. Other researchers hold more measured expectations, suggesting that the central state archives, wherever they once stood, were most likely destroyed long ago. Not hidden, but genuinely gone, lost to fire, flood, and reuse in the ordinary churn of a city that never stopped being inhabited. Under this view, the fragments we already possess may represent close to the practical ceiling of what will ever be recoverable, and the gaps in Egyptian history we've explored throughout this journey may remain gaps permanently, filled only by careful inference rather than definitive documentation. And yet the discoveries of the last century counsel some humility about ruling anything out entirely. Tutankhamun's tomb sat undisturbed and largely unsuspected for over 3,000 years before Howard Carter's excavation. The Amarna letters themselves were unknown to modern scholarship until a chance discovery in 1887. Egypt has a long history of overturning assumptions about what could possibly still be found. Somewhere beneath the streets of modern Luxor, or perhaps nowhere at all, may lie the answers to nearly every mystery this exploration has raised. The identity of a grieving queen, the true cause of a civil war, the fate of a usurper king. Until and unless that archive surfaces, Egypt's early New Kingdom will remain what it has always been to those who study it. A history assembled from fragments, told in the negative space of everything that never survived to tell it directly. In the necropolis of Saqqara, scattered among the causeways and satellite pyramids of the Old Kingdom's greatest builders, sit dozens of smaller tombs belonging not to kings, but to the officials who served them. Viziers, treasurers, overseers of granaries and expeditions, men whose titles alone once represented the beating administrative heart of the Egyptian state. Walk among them today, and a peculiar pattern begins to emerge. The tombs grow smaller, the inscriptions grow sparser, And then, within the span of what archaeologists estimate as little more than a generation, they largely stopped being built at all. We have spent much of this exploration examining gaps left by missing archives, erased names, and vanished individuals. But the mystery we turn to now is different in scale entirely. Not the disappearance of one queen, one usurper, or one contested king, but the sudden and still poorly understood collapse of an entire governing class, an elite that had run Egypt's old kingdom for centuries, and then, in a remarkably short window of time, simply ceased to hold the power it once had. The Sixth Dynasty represents, in many respects, the final flourishing of the Old Kingdom's traditional order, the age of pyramid building, centralized royal authority, and a bureaucracy that extended the pharaoh's reach from Memphis into every corner of Egypt through a hierarchy of appointed officials. We have already touched on its uncertain opening chapter, the brief and shadowy reign of Userkare wedged between Teti and Pepi I. What followed, for a time, was stability. Pepi I ruled for decades. His son, Pepi II, ascended the throne as a child and went on to reign longer than perhaps any monarch in recorded history. Traditional estimates place his rule at over 90 years, though modern scholars debate whether that figure reflects genuine chronology or a later scribal exaggeration born from confusion or reverence. And then, within a few decades of Pepi II's death, the centralized state that the Sixth Dynasty had maintained for generations simply came apart. The most immediate evidence lies precisely where we began, in the tombs of Saqqara and in similar elite burial grounds across Egypt. Officials who once commanded resources sufficient to build elaborate, richly decorated tombs near their king's own pyramid saw their families' fortunes shrink dramatically, and in many cases, disappear from the archaeological record entirely within a generation or two. The great families of viziers and treasurers who had served the crown for centuries stop appearing in dated inscriptions. Provincial governors, once appointed directly by and answerable to the king, begin instead to establish what appear to be hereditary, semi-independent power bases in their own regions, commissioning tombs decorated with imagery emphasizing personal and local authority rather than deference to a distant, weakening throne. What caused this unraveling? The mainstream explanation, developed over decades of archaeological and textual analysis, points to a convergence of pressures rather than any single dramatic event. Pepi II's extraordinarily long reign, whatever its precise length, may itself have been part of the problem. A king who ascended as a child and ruled into extreme old age would have created, over the course of that reign, an aging and increasingly entrenched bureaucracy, provincial governors who held their positions for decades and passed influence to their sons in all but official name, gradually eroding the crown's ability to appoint, remove, or control officials the way earlier, shorter reigns had allowed. By the time Pepi II finally died, the machinery of centralized appointment that had defined the Old Kingdom's administrative strength may have already been hollowed out from within, replaced by regional dynasties operating under a veneer of royal loyalty that no longer reflected genuine central control. Environmental evidence adds another layer to this picture, one that has gained increasing attention among researchers in recent decades. Studies of Nile flood records, reconstructed through various geological and sedimentary methods, suggest the possibility of a series of unusually low Nile inundations occurring around the end of the Old Kingdom, a climatic shift that, if accurate, would have devastated Egypt's agricultural output at precisely the moment its administrative structures were least equipped to manage a crisis. A centralized state with strong provincial loyalty might have weathered such a disruption through coordinated grain redistribution, drawing on reserves from more fortunate regions to support those hit hardest by failed floods. A state already fracturing into semi-independent regional powers, each looking primarily to its own survival, would have had far less capacity, and perhaps far less will, to manage such a crisis collectively. The succession crisis following Pepi II's death only compounds these difficulties. The Sixth Dynasty's final years include shadowy, poorly attested rulers. A queen named Nitocris appears in later traditions, including in the account of the Greek historian Herodotus, though her historical reality remains disputed among modern Egyptologists, with some scholars suspecting she may be a later legendary figure rather than confirmed historical monarch. Whatever the truth of individual rulers during this final stretch, the pattern is unmistakable. A rapid succession of kings, none able to reconsolidate the authority that had slipped away during Pepi II's long final decades, until the Old Kingdom's central government effectively ceased to function as a unified authority at all. What followed is generally known to historians as the First Intermediate Period, an era once described in older scholarship as a chaotic dark age of famine, civil war, and cultural collapse. More recent research has softened this picture considerably, revealing regional courts, particularly in Heracleopolis and later Thebes, that maintained their own administrations, artistic traditions, and eventually competing claims to rule all of Egypt once again. But softened or not, the transition remains a genuine rupture, the abrupt end of a governing elite whose families had, in some cases, held power for well over 100 years, replaced by a fractured political landscape that would take generations to fully reunify. Some researchers have pushed further into more speculative territory, wondering whether the very inscriptions provincial governors left behind during this period, emphasizing their own personal virtue, generosity during famine, and independent authority, might themselves represent a kind of quiet civil conflict playing out through funerary boasting rather than open warfare, each regional leader asserting a legitimacy that implicitly denied the relevance of a central throne that no longer had the power to contest such claims directly. Was the fall of the Sixth Dynasty elite the inevitable result of one king simply ruling too long for any bureaucracy to survive intact? Was it accelerated, or even primarily caused by a climate shift no ancient administration could have anticipated or withstood? Or did the seeds of collapse lie further back still, in the same fragile, contested succession that gave Egypt a shadowy usurper named Userkare generations earlier, planting instabilities within the royal house that simply took a century to fully unravel? The tombs at Saqqara offer no verdict of their own. They simply grow smaller, and then quieter, and then largely stop. A governing class that spent centuries building monuments meant to last forever, undone within the span of a single long reign, and leaving behind a silence that Egyptologists are still, carefully, trying to fill. On the inner walls of the Temple of Khonsu at Karnak, in a structure built within the sacred precinct of Amun himself, a relief shows a man performing rituals and wearing regalia that in any earlier period of Egyptian history would have belonged exclusively to a king. He wears a royal uraeus. His name appears enclosed in a cartouche, the oval that marked pharaonic identity for thousands of years. And yet this man was never meant to be a king at all, at least not by the traditional rules that had governed Egyptian kingship since the pyramids first rose at Giza. His name was Herihor, and his sudden, unexplained arrival at the very summit of Egyptian power remains one of the more genuinely puzzling transitions in the country's long history. We have followed, in this exploration, an empire whose central authority fractured slowly, over generations, through long reigns and eroding provincial loyalty. What happened at the end of the New Kingdom, and what produced Herihor, appears different, more abrupt, more difficult to trace to any single clear cause, and considerably better documented in its outcome than in its origins. By the closing years of the 20th dynasty, Egypt's New Kingdom empire was already a shadow of what it had been under rulers like Ramesses II. The last king to bear the name Ramesses, the 11th of that name, presided over a country beset by economic strain, tomb robberies plaguing even the supposedly secure Valley of the Kings, and a growing disconnect between the authority of the throne in the north and the practical governance of Thebes in the south. It was in Thebes, the ancient religious capital, and home to the enormously wealthy and influential priesthood of Amun, that Herihor rose to prominence, not through royal bloodline, but through the office of High Priest of Amun, a position that had, over the preceding decades, accumulated an extraordinary concentration of land, wealth, and political authority in Upper Egypt. What we do not know, and what continues to divide historians, is precisely how Herihor moved from that priestly office to the trappings of kingship itself. The most widely accepted account suggests a gradual accumulation of power that eventually outpaced its own formal justification. Herihor held not only the position of high priest, but also, according to surviving inscriptions, military titles including commander of the army, along with the role of vizier, an unprecedented concentration of religious, military, and administrative authority in a single individual, all while Ramesses V still, at least nominally, occupied the throne in the north. Some historians describe this arrangement as a kind of practical division of Egypt, with Ramesses X retaining symbolic and formal kingship, while real control of Upper Egypt rested increasingly, and perhaps increasingly openly, in Herihor's hands. The puzzle deepens considerably once we reach the Temple of Khonsu reliefs themselves, where Herihor appears not merely as a powerful official acting in the king's name, but adorned with full royal iconography, his name written in a cartouche in a manner reserved exclusively for pharaohs. Was this a formal, negotiated arrangement, perhaps even sanctioned in some fashion by Ramesses V himself, as the aging king's authority contracted to little more than the Delta region? Or did Herihor simply claim these royal trappings unilaterally, asserting a kingship that existed in Thebes and its immediate religious sphere without ever being formally recognized, or perhaps even contested, by the official court in the north? No treaty, no formal proclamation, no unambiguous document survives to answer this question directly. What we have instead are the inscriptions themselves, the physical fact of royal imagery applied to a man who, by every traditional rule of Egyptian succession, had no blood claim to wear it. Complicating the picture further is the matter of Herihor's own origins, which remain frustratingly obscure. Unlike most claimants to the Egyptian throne, no clear record establishes his parentage, his early career, or how exactly he first entered the priesthood of Amun before his rapid ascent to its highest office. Some scholars have speculated that his rise may be connected to broader instability following a period of unrest in Thebes known from other sources as the Renaissance-era reforms under Ramesses X, a period during which the king's own inscriptions describe efforts to restore order after what appears to have been serious civil disturbance in Upper Egypt, possibly involving conflict with a previous Theban official whose own authority had grown similarly excessive. Was Herihor installed as a stabilizing figure in the aftermath of this unrest, trusted precisely because of his military credentials? Or did he take advantage of that same instability to seize an opportunity for himself, filling a vacuum left by his predecessor's fall from favor? What followed Herihor's death is, if anything, equally uncertain. He was succeeded, not by an obvious hereditary heir in the way Egyptian kingship traditionally worked, but by a man named Piank, whose relationship to Herihor remains debated among historians, some proposing him as a son, others suggesting a more distant connection, or even a rival successor whose own claim to the high priesthood and its accumulated authority owed less to Herihor's blood than to his own separate standing within Thebes' military and religious hierarchy. The chronology of this transition has proven so difficult to establish with confidence that some Egyptologists have proposed reversing the traditional order entirely, suggesting Piank may have preceded Herihor rather than followed him, a revision that would rewrite the sequence of events at the very end of the New Kingdom in a way that remains actively contested in scholarly literature today. What emerged from this uncertain transition was not, strictly speaking, a unified reversal to traditional kingship, but the beginning of what historians now call the Third Intermediate Period, an era in which Egypt would be governed, at various points, by competing centers of power in the north and south, with the high priest of Amun in Thebes maintaining an authority in Upper Egypt that operated in an uneasy, shifting relationship with whoever held the more traditional throne in the Delta. Herihor's brief and strange claim to royal imagery, whatever its precise legal or political standing in his own time, seems to have set a precedent, or at least revealed a possibility, that Egyptian kingship itself was no longer as singular or as sacred as it had once been treated for thousands of years. Was Herihor a legitimate king in every sense his inscriptions claim, ruling a genuinely divided Egypt with Ramesses XI's tacit acceptance? Was he a powerful regional official who simply appropriated royal symbols his actual authority never quite matched? And why does a man who commanded such extraordinary concentrated power leave behind so little clear record of where he came from, or precisely how he justified, even to his own contemporaries, wearing a crown that centuries of tradition said belonged to bloodlines entirely different from his own? The reliefs at Karnak's Temple of Khonsu still show him dressed as a king, performing rituals as a king, named in the sacred oval reserved for kings. Whether Egypt itself, in his own lifetime, ever fully agreed with that portrait is a question the temple walls, for all their careful detail, were never quite willing to settle. Along a stretch of the Nile now largely submerged beneath the waters of Lake Nasser, massive mud-brick walls once rose from the desert at a site called Buin, fortifications so formidable that early 20th century excavators compared them to medieval European castles, complete with towers, ramparts, and a dry moat cut directly into bedrock. Before flooding forced their partial relocation in the 1960s, these walls stood as one of the most impressive displays of ancient military engineering anywhere in the Nile Valley. And for reasons that remain only partly understood, Egypt built an entire chain of fortresses like this one along its southern frontier, garrisoned them for centuries, and then, within a relatively short span of time, simply let them go. We have traced, throughout this exploration, an empire whose power waxed and waned in fits of contested succession, quiet erasure, and slow institutional decay. The abandonment of Egypt's Nubian fortress network presents a different kind of puzzle entirely. Not the collapse of a dynasty or the disappearance of a person, but the withdrawal of a state from territory it had spent enormous resources securing for reasons its own records describe only in fragments. The fortresses themselves date primarily to the Middle Kingdom, constructed under pharaohs like Senusret III during the 12th dynasty, roughly the 19th century BC. They formed a chain stretching along the Nile's Second Cataract region, an area of dangerous rapids that marked a natural choke point between Egypt proper and the lands of Nubia to the south. Sites like Buhin, Semna, and Mergisa were not simple garrison outposts, but sophisticated administrative and military installations, equipped with granaries capable of supplying troops for extended periods, sally ports allowing defenders to strike out against besiegers, and in some cases, systems for signaling between fortresses to warn of approaching threats along the river. The purpose of this network seems, on its surface, straightforward. Nubia possessed resources Egypt valued enormously: gold, ivory, exotic goods funneled from deeper in Africa, and, crucially, human labor. Inscriptions from this period describe the southern frontier in explicitly restrictive terms, with boundary stelae erected under Senusret III, declaring the frontier closed to Nubian traders except under tightly controlled circumstances, and warning of severe consequences for unauthorized crossings. This was not merely a defensive network protecting Egypt from invasion, but an instrument of economic control, regulating and profiting from trade that passed through this narrow stretch of river. For roughly 2 centuries, Egypt maintained this system with evident commitment, garrisoning the fortresses continuously, repairing and expanding them as needed, and integrating them into a broader administrative structure that kept Nubian trade firmly under Egyptian oversight. And then, toward the end of the Middle Kingdom, as Egypt itself entered a period of internal weakness known as the Second Intermediate Period, the fortresses appear to have been abandoned, in some cases quite suddenly, their garrisons withdrawn, or, in certain documented instances, evidently overwhelmed. What caused this withdrawal? The most direct explanation connects the fortress's abandonment to Egypt's broader internal collapse during this period. As centralized authority weakened in the Nile Delta, with the eventual rise of foreign Hyksos rulers controlling parts of northern Egypt, the resources and administrative capacity needed to maintain a distant, expensive fortress network in the far south would have become increasingly difficult to sustain. A weakened Egyptian state, focused on managing crises much closer to its political heartland, may simply have been unable to continue funding and staffing installations hundreds of miles from Memphis or Thebes, leading to a gradual, resource-driven withdrawal rather than any single dramatic event. But archaeological evidence at several sites complicates this straightforward narrative considerably. At Mergisa, excavators uncovered evidence some researchers have interpreted as signs of violent conflict, correspondence, and execration texts. Ritual curses inscribed on figurines or pottery meant to invoke destruction upon named or unnamed enemies, suggesting the garrison anticipated genuine hostile threats rather than simply winding down operations peacefully. Letters discovered at Semnai, part of an archive known as the Semna Dispatches, record routine border surveillance reports describing the movement of Nubian groups near the frontier, some noting patrols and reconnaissance that suggest an atmosphere of ongoing tension rather than settled peace, even during the fortress's operational peak. This raises the question of who, precisely, Egypt was worried about. The Kingdom of Kush, centered further south at Kerma, had been growing in wealth and organizational sophistication throughout this same period, developing what archaeological evidence suggests was an increasingly powerful and centralized state of its own, capable of fielding organized military forces and engaging in complex diplomatic and economic relationships across the region. Some historians propose that the eventual abandonment of Egypt's fortress network coincided not merely with Egypt's internal weakness, but with a shift in the regional balance of power, as Kerma's kingdom grew strong enough to make continued Egyptian control of the Second Cataract increasingly costly, or even directly untenable, to maintain by force. Evidence from this transitional period suggests that at least some Nubian fortresses were not simply abandoned, but were subsequently occupied, at least partially, by Kerma-affiliated populations, with archaeological layers showing a shift in material culture at former Egyptian installations, consistent with new inhabitants, rather than empty, deserted ruins. Was this occupation the result of active conquest, Kerma's forces moving in as Egyptian garrisons withdrew or were overwhelmed? Or did it happen more gradually, local populations simply moving into structures Egypt had already chosen to vacate as it redirected its shrinking resources elsewhere? A further complication comes from Correspondence, suggesting some Egyptian officials in this frontier region may have continued operating with a degree of independence even as central authority weakened, raising the possibility that the fortress network's decline was uneven rather than uniform, with certain installations maintained by locally resourceful commanders even as royal support from the north diminished or disappeared entirely, while others fell more quickly into disuse or outside control. If true, this would mean the story of the network's fall is not a single narrative at all, but many separate, smaller stories of individual garrisons, each facing its own particular combination of pressure, isolation, and eventual decision or defeat. What ties all of this together is a stretch of frontier that once represented one of the ancient world's most impressive displays of coordinated state power, and its slow, only partially documented unraveling as that power waned. When Egypt's new kingdom rulers eventually reasserted control over Nubia centuries later, some of these same fortress sites were reoccupied and rebuilt, suggesting later generations of Egyptians still recognize the strategic value of positions their Middle Kingdom ancestors had once been forced to abandon. Did Kerma's rising kingdom actively drive Egypt from these walls through military pressure, exploiting a moment of northern weakness to reclaim its own frontier? Did Egypt's retreat happen through slower attrition, a state simply too consumed by internal crisis to sustain a distant and expensive commitment? Or does the truth lie somewhere between these explanations, a patchwork of local decisions, isolated conflicts, and gradual disengagement that no single surviving record was positioned to describe in full? Beneath the waters of Lake Nasser now, and in the relocated fragments of walls once meant to stand for centuries, the fortresses of the Second Cataract keep whatever fuller account they might once have offered largely to themselves. In the tomb of a provincial official named Weni, carved into the limestone cliffs near Abydos, an autobiography stretches across the walls in dense columns of hieroglyphic text, one of the longest and most detailed personal accounts to survive from Egypt's Old Kingdom. Weni describes a long and distinguished career serving several pharaohs, rising through the ranks of the administration with evident pride in his own accomplishments. And tucked within this otherwise straightforward record of loyal service is a single, tantalizing line, deliberately vague, describing a secret matter involving the royal harem that required investigation in private. A matter so sensitive that Weni states he alone, among all the kingdom's officials, was trusted to hear the case. We return now to the 6th dynasty, to the reign of Pepi I, the same king whose ascension we touched on earlier as the presumed resolution to Userkare's shadowy interruption of the royal line. Pepi I ruled for decades, one of the more successful and well-documented monarchs of his era. But buried within that otherwise solid reign lies this strange, deliberately obscured episode recorded by the one man entrusted with resolving it, who tells us that something happened without ever quite telling us what. The passage in Weni's tomb reads, in essence, that a case arose in the royal harem against the Great One, a title generally understood to refer to one of Pepi I's own wives, and that King Pepi ordered Weni to enter alone and hear the matter without the involvement of any other high official, specifically noting that no vizier, no other judge, was present for the proceedings. This detail alone signals that whatever occurred, it was considered far too sensitive, too potentially damaging to the crown's stability or reputation, to be handled through Egypt's normal judicial channels involving the full apparatus of court officials who would typically oversee matters of this seriousness. What, precisely, was the accusation? Weni never says. His inscription describes the honor of being chosen for this confidential task with evident pride, emphasizing his own trustworthiness and discretion. But the content of the case itself, the identity of the accused queen, and the eventual verdict all remain entirely unstated. This is, in itself, a telling silence. Weni's autobiography is otherwise remarkably forthcoming, detailing military campaigns, administrative achievements, and his own career advancement in considerable specificity. The deliberate vagueness surrounding this particular episode suggests not oversight, but careful, intentional discretion, a matter Weni understood he was meant to describe only in outline, never in substance, even in a monument meant to record his life's proudest achievements for eternity. Historians have proposed several readings of what this secret harem case might actually have involved. The most commonly suggested explanation points towards some form of conspiracy against the king himself, potentially involving a plot to remove or replace Pepi the Fern, orchestrated or supported by one of his own wives, possibly in coordination with other figures within the palace. Royal harems in ancient Egypt were not simply domestic quarters, but held genuine political significance, housing wives, their attendants, and administrative staff who manage substantial economic resources and maintain their own networks of influence and loyalty within the broader court. A queen positioning a son for succession ahead of a rival, or aligning herself with officials seeking to undermine the king's authority, would represent exactly the kind of threat serious enough to require the secretive, tightly controlled investigation Weni describes. This reading gains some additional, if circumstantial, support from what we know occurred later in Pepi Thorn's reign. His eventual marriage to two sisters, both daughters of a provincial official from Abydos, women who became known to history primarily through the titles Ankhesenamun I and Ankhesenamun II. Ankhesenamun II would go on to become the mother of Pepi II, whose extraordinarily long reign we explored earlier in this journey. Some historians have speculated that these marriages, elevating a provincial family to unprecedented royal prominence, might connect somehow to the fallout from the harem conspiracy, either as a deliberate move by Pepi the Ferns to secure new, more trustworthy alliances following a betrayal within his existing household, or as evidence of a broader pattern of political maneuvering surrounding succession that extended well beyond the single incident when he was called upon to investigate. Other scholars caution against reading too much political intrigue into a passage this brief and ambiguous, suggesting the case in question might have involved something considerably less dramatic than an assassination plot. Perhaps a matter of internal harem discipline, a dispute over inheritance or property among royal wives and their households, or an accusation of misconduct that, while embarrassing to the crown, fell well short of outright conspiracy against the king's life or throne. Under this more measured reading, Weni's selection for the task reflects not the gravity of a near-catastrophic plot, but simply the crown's general preference for discretion in any matter touching directly on the royal family's private affairs, regardless of how serious the underlying issue actually was. The truth may lie in some combination neither reading captures fully. Ancient Egyptian sources, even ones as detailed as Weni's autobiography, were composed for specific purposes. In this case, to celebrate Weni's own career and loyalty, rather than to provide historians with clear documentary evidence 3,500 years later. The ambiguity we find so frustrating today may reflect not a mystery Weni himself considered particularly complex, but simply a subject he, and by extension his king, agreed was never meant to be fully explained to anyone outside the small circle originally involved. What happened to the queen accused in this case remains entirely unknown. No record confirms whether she was punished, exiled, or ultimately exonerated. No inscription names her directly, leaving historians unable even to determine with certainty which of Pepi Thorn's wives stood at the center of this episode, or whether she was a wife from earlier in his reign, replaced afterward by the Ankhesenamun sisters, or someone whose identity has been lost entirely, alongside whatever fate the investigation ultimately determined for her. Weni's tomb, for all its remarkable detail about the rest of his life and career, closes this particular chapter as quickly as it opens it, moving on to describe his subsequent achievements without a backward glance at the secret he was trusted to help resolve. Was this the record of a conspiracy that nearly toppled a king, quietly contained before it could spread further through the court? Or a more modest domestic dispute, elevated in Weni's telling primarily because of the personal honor he took in being the one selected to handle it? The walls near Abydos preserve the fact of the investigation in Weni's own proud words, and nothing more. Whatever truly happened within Pepi Thorn's royal harem remains locked behind a discretion so effective that even the one man who claimed full knowledge of the case chose, deliberately and permanently, never to write it down. On a granite stela erected at Gebel Barkal, deep in Nubia far south of Egypt's traditional heartland, Pharaoh Thutmose III left behind an inscription boasting of military achievements across an empire that by the time of its carving stretched further than any Egyptian ruler had previously claimed. Among the many campaigns recorded on monuments from his reign, one stands out for the strange imbalance between the confidence of its claims and the thinness of the evidence supporting them. A campaign against the kingdom of Mitanni, a rival power whose full extent, capital city, and even the precise nature of Egypt's military engagement with it remain even now only partially understood. We have followed, throughout this exploration, mysteries defined largely by absence, vanished archives, erased names, unexplained withdrawals. The Mitanni campaigns present something subtly different, not an absence of evidence exactly, but a persistent gap between Egypt's own triumphant self-description and the corroborating detail modern historians would need to fully verify, contextualize, or even geographically locate what actually happened. Mitanni emerged during the 16th century BC as a major power in northern Mesopotamia and Syria, ruled by a Hurrian-speaking elite whose kingdom controlled critical trade routes and buffer territory between Egypt's expanding sphere of influence and the other great powers of the region, including the Hittites we have already encountered through the story of Zannanza. By the time Thutmose III came to full independent power in the 15th century BC, following the unusual co-regency and eventual overshadowing of his stepmother Hatshepsut, Mitanni stood as one of Egypt's primary rivals for control of the Levant, a contested zone of city-states and trade routes that both empires had strong incentive to dominate. Thutmose III's military campaigns in this region are, on the surface, some of the best documented achievements of his entire reign. Detailed annals inscribed at the Temple of Karnak record year after year of campaigning, including the famous Battle of Megiddo, fought against a coalition of Levantine city-states, described in enough tactical detail that some modern military historians have used it as an early case study in siege warfare and battlefield strategy. Against this backdrop of relatively rich documentation, the specific campaigns against Mitanni itself stand out as comparatively vague, almost formulaic by comparison. Thutmose III's inscriptions claim he crossed the Euphrates River, an extraordinary feat given the river's distance from Egypt and the sheer logistical challenge of moving an army that far from its home territory, and that he erected a boundary stela there marking the furthest extent of Egyptian military reach, deliberately placed, according to the inscriptions, near a similar marker left by his grandfather Thutmose III decades earlier. The annals describe the king pursuing Mitannian forces, who reportedly fled before him, and boast of overwhelming victory. But what these accounts conspicuously lack is the kind of granular tactical detail present in the Megiddo account, or crucially, any clear description of a direct confrontation with Mitanni's actual capital or king. No named Mitannian ruler appears as a defeated counterpart in these particular records. No siege of a major Mitannian city is described. The campaign reads, in places, more like a triumphant procession through contested territory than an account of a decisive military conquest of an entire rival kingdom. Why the discrepancy? The most straightforward explanation offered by historians suggests that Thutmose III's Mitanni campaign, however genuinely successful in demonstrating Egyptian military reach and securing tribute or temporary submission from local rulers along the way, may never have actually threatened Mitanni's core territory or capital in any serious way. Under this reading, crossing the Euphrates and erecting a boundary marker represented an enormously significant symbolic and propagandistic achievement, worth extensive commemoration precisely because it demonstrated Egyptian power reaching further than any prior pharaoh, even if the practical military outcome amounted to a demonstration of reach rather than a genuine conquest of Mitanni's homeland further east. This interpretation aligns with what we know of the conflict's eventual resolution. Egypt and Mitanni, despite decades of rivalry and periodic warfare across multiple pharaohs' reigns, eventually settled into a peaceful diplomatic relationship, sealed through royal marriages between the two courts in the generations following Thutmose III. This eventual alliance, well documented through later diplomatic correspondence, including some of the same Amarna letters that first introduced us to the Dakhamunzu affair, suggests a relationship between two roughly matched powers who found peaceful coexistence more sustainable than continued warfare, rather than one in which Egypt had ever achieved the kind of total military dominance its most triumphant inscriptions might imply. But this raises its own set of unresolved questions. If Thutmose III never seriously threatened Mitanni's core territory, why does the location of Mitanni's own capital, a city called Washukani, remain unidentified by modern archaeology to this day? Historians have proposed several general locations in the Khabur River region of modern Syria based on textual clues from various ancient sources. But no site has been conclusively excavated and confirmed as the city itself. This absence complicates any effort to fully assess the true military balance between the two kingdoms during this period. Without a confirmed capital to compare against Egyptian claims of reaching Mitanni's heartland, historians are left evaluating Thutmose III's boasts largely in isolation, unable to cross-reference them against corresponding Mitannian records, since virtually no comparable Mitannian inscriptions describing their own side of this conflict have survived at all. This absence of a Mitannian perspective is itself part of the broader pattern of vanished archives explored earlier in this journey. Mitanni's own written records, to the extent they existed in comparable volume to Egypt's, have simply not survived in any meaningful quantity, leaving modern historians dependent almost entirely on the inherently one-sided, self-promotional Egyptian sources to reconstruct a conflict that, by its very nature, involved two parties whose competing accounts we can no longer compare against one another. Some researchers have speculated further, wondering whether later Mitannian decline, culminating eventually in the kingdom's conquest and absorption by the rising Hittite and Assyrian powers within a few generations of Thutmose III's campaigns, might retroactively have discouraged later Egyptian scribes from any need to record more detailed or nuanced accounts of a rival that would, within living memory, cease to exist as an independent threat altogether. If Mitanni's ultimate fate rendered the specifics of Thutmose III's campaign less politically relevant to preserve in fuller detail, that alone might explain why later generations felt no strong need to expand upon or clarify records that already served their primary propagandistic purpose. What remains, carved into temple walls and a lonely boundary stela somewhere along the Euphrates that has never been rediscovered by modern archaeology, is a campaign whose broad strokes we can outline with confidence and whose precise military reality continues to resist full reconstruction. Did Thutmose III achieve a genuine strategic triumph against one of the ancient world's major powers, or a symbolically potent but militarily limited demonstration of reach that later diplomacy, rather than outright conquest, ultimately resolved into lasting peace? And where, beneath the modern landscape of northern Syria, does Washukani itself still wait, holding whatever record of this conflict Mitanni's own scribes may once have kept? The Euphrates still flows past wherever that ancient boundary marker once stood. Its exact location, like so much of Mitanni's side of this story, remains for now beyond recovery. On the island of Elephantine, at Egypt's southern frontier near the First Cataract, a scatter of mud brick foundations marks what once was a garrison town populated not by native Egyptians, but by foreign soldiers stationed there in service of the pharaoh. Men whose weapons, burial customs, and personal names identified them as coming from lands to Egypt's northeast, hired or conscripted into a military apparatus that depended at various points in its long history far more heavily on foreign manpower than the popular image of Egypt as a purely native, self-contained civilization tends to suggest. Some of these men rose high. A handful, according to surviving inscriptions, commanded entire garrisons, held titles placing them in direct authority over Egyptian troops, and married into local families with enough standing to leave behind tombs of genuine quality. And then, at several distinct moments across Egyptian history, these same commanders and the communities they led simply stop appearing in the record, their fates as unrecorded as their arrivals were, in most cases, unexplained to begin with. We have followed a rival kingdom whose own voice never survived to answer Egypt's boasts. We turn now to a mystery embedded within Egypt's own borders, among people who lived, fought, and in some cases governed alongside native Egyptians for generations, whose collective disappearance from the historical record raises questions not about foreign conquest, but about assimilation, expulsion, or something else entirely that Egypt's own scribes chose, for reasons we can only partially reconstruct, not to explain. The broad term historians use for these foreign soldiers is Asiatics, a label ancient Egyptian sources applied generally to peoples from the Levant, Syria, and the broader region to Egypt's northeast, encompassing a wide range of distinct ethnic and linguistic groups that Egyptian texts rarely bothered to distinguish with the specificity modern historians would prefer. Their presence in Egyptian military service stretches back at least to the Middle Kingdom, and likely earlier, with texts and archaeological evidence suggesting these foreign troops served in various capacities, from garrison duty at frontier fortresses like those we explored in Nubia, to more prestigious roles as personal guards and household troops for wealthy Egyptian officials, to, in certain periods, command positions overseeing mixed forces of foreign and native soldiers alike. The most extensively documented, and most genuinely puzzling, chapter in this story concerns the period following the expulsion of the Hyksos, the foreign dynasty of Levantine origin that had ruled portions of northern Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period, the same era of internal weakness that saw Egypt's Nubian fortress network fall into disuse. Egypt's New Kingdom pharaohs, particularly Ahmose I, who is generally credited with finally driving Hyksos rule from Egyptian territory, might reasonably be expected to have viewed Asiatic peoples within Egypt with lasting suspicion following this conflict. And to some degree, the record does reflect exactly this kind of tension, with royal inscriptions from Ahmose's reign celebrating the expulsion in triumphant, at times explicitly hostile language toward these foreign rulers, and, by extension, the broader populations associated with them. And yet, remarkably, Asiatic soldiers and officials continue to appear in Egyptian service throughout the subsequent New Kingdom, in some cases holding positions of genuine trust and authority within the very military and administrative structures that had just fought to expel a foreign dynasty. This apparent contradiction, celebrated hostility toward Asiatic rule alongside continued, even expanded reliance on Asiatic manpower within Egypt's own forces, has never been fully reconciled by historians, and the specific mechanisms by which individual commanders moved between these categories, from potential enemy to trusted officer, remain largely undocumented. Some of the clearest evidence for this pattern comes from a series of scarabs, seals, and administrative texts identifying specific individuals bearing distinctly Levantine or Semitic names who held military titles during the early New Kingdom, including references to men serving as garrison commanders or overseers of foreign troops integrated directly into Egypt's own forces. A figure sometimes referenced in scholarly literature by the title Overseer of Northerners appears in various periods, suggesting an ongoing administrative office specifically responsible for managing the substantial population of foreign, primarily Asiatic, residents and soldiers within Egyptian territory. Yet the individuals who held this and similar titles across different reigns are, in most cases, known only from a single artifact or brief inscription, offering us a title and sometimes a name, but almost nothing about the broader arc of these men's careers, their eventual fates, or what became of the communities and family lines they represented. This is where the mystery deepens beyond simple gaps in documentation. At several points across Egyptian history, archaeological and textual evidence suggesting a substantial established Asiatic military or administrative presence at a particular site or period appears to diminish sharply, sometimes within what seems to be a single generation, without any corresponding text explaining a policy shift, expulsion order, or military conflict that would account for the change. Communities that appear well integrated, holding land, titles, and apparently secure social standing in one period, simply become far less visible in the material and textual record shortly afterward. The most commonly proposed explanation for this pattern is assimilation rather than expulsion or violent removal. Under this reading, Asiatic soldiers and their families, over successive generations, gradually adopted Egyptian names, religious practices, and cultural markers to the point where their foreign origin became archaeologically and textually invisible, indistinguishable from native Egyptian officials in the material record, even if their actual ancestry remained, in a strictly genealogical sense, foreign. This would not represent a disappearance in any literal sense, but rather a successful, thorough integration into Egyptian society so complete that it erased the very markers historians rely on to trace these families forward through time. Under this interpretation, there is no mystery of vanished people at all, only a mystery of vanished evidence, the natural and perhaps intended outcome of a policy of cultural absorption rather than segregation. But this explanation, however plausible for many individual cases, does not comfortably account for every instance of this pattern, particularly moments when the disappearance coincides suspiciously closely with periods of broader political upheaval or anti-foreign sentiment recorded elsewhere in Egyptian sources. The reign of Amenhotep II, son of Thutmose III, offers one such example, with inscriptions describing the king personally executing captured foreign chieftains and displaying their bodies as a demonstration of royal power following his own military campaigns in the Levant, language considerably more hostile toward foreign populations than we find in many surrounding reigns. Do we see in the years following Amenhotep II's reign any corresponding contraction in the presence or prominence of Asiatic officials within Egypt itself? Some researchers have proposed a connection, suggesting that periods of heightened military conflict abroad may have generated corresponding suspicion toward resident foreign populations at home, potentially contributing to the kind of career disruption, demotion, or quiet marginalization that would produce exactly the pattern of disappearance visible in the record, without ever requiring an explicit documented policy of expulsion to explain it. Other historians point toward economic and demographic explanations entirely separate from questions of ethnic tension. Military garrisons, particularly at frontier locations, were subject to periodic reorganization, relocation, or reduction based on Egypt's shifting strategic priorities, entirely independent of the ethnic background of the soldiers stationed there. A garrison town's declining prominence in the archaeological record might simply reflect changing military needs. A fortress no longer considered strategically essential, its garrison reduced or redeployed elsewhere, its foreign soldiers dispersed to other postings rather than removed from Egyptian service altogether. Under this reading, what looks like disappearance may in fact be redistribution, individuals and communities scattered across a wider, less concentrated, and therefore less archaeologically visible pattern of settlement, rather than any coordinated removal or systematic assimilation. A further complication involves the later Amarna period and its own turbulent aftermath, an era we have already examined extensively in this exploration for its own distinct mysteries. Some scholars have wondered whether the religious upheaval of Akhenaten's reign and the subsequent restoration of traditional worship under his successors might have had ripple effects on foreign military and administrative personnel whose own religious practices or political loyalties became entangled, fairly or not, with the broader instability of this period. If certain Asiatic officials had risen to prominence during Akhenaten's reign specifically, their fortunes might well have declined sharply during the aggressive restoration of traditional religious and political order that followed, caught up in a broader purge of Amarna-associated figures regardless of their own individual actions or loyalties during the crisis. What makes this mystery particularly resistant to resolution is the sheer diversity of individual cases folded together under the single broad category of Asiatic in Egyptian sources. A garrison commander at a Nubian fortress, a household guard serving a wealthy vizier in Memphis, and an administrator overseeing foreign trade in the Delta might all be labeled with similar terminology in surviving texts, despite representing entirely different social positions, career trajectories, and, quite possibly, entirely different explanations for their eventual disappearance from the record. Attempting to identify a single unified cause, whether assimilation, expulsion, redistribution, or religious upheaval, may be attempting to solve several genuinely separate historical questions as though they were one continuous mystery, when in reality Egypt's relationship with its Asiatic military and administrative population likely varied considerably across different reigns, regions, and individual circumstances that our surviving sources are simply too fragmentary to fully distinguish from one another. What survives at Elephantine, and at similar sites scattered across Egypt's frontiers and administrative centers, are the physical traces of people who mattered enough, at least for a time, to leave behind tombs, titles, and inscriptions recording their service to a foreign crown they had, in some sense, made their own. Whether their descendants melted seamlessly into Egyptian society, were pushed quietly out of positions of trust during moments of political anxiety, or simply scattered to postings the archaeological record has not yet located and connected back to them, remains an open question for each individual case, multiplied across centuries of Egyptian history. Did these communities vanish because Egypt absorbed them so completely that their foreign origins ceased to matter, even to themselves? Or did suspicion, political upheaval, and shifting royal favor gradually push them back out of the positions of trust their service had once earned them? The mud brick foundations at Elephantine, worn by centuries of Nile floods and shifting sand, offer no clearer answer than the scattered inscriptions and scarabs bearing names that appear once, prominently, and then never again. On the inner walls of the Temple of Amun at Karnak, in a passage known to Egyptologists as the Chronicle of Prince Userkare, a lengthy inscription records, in unusually candid detail, a period of civil unrest so severe that its author describes years of open conflict, interrupted temple rites, and a kingdom effectively divided against itself. The text was carved not by a king celebrating triumph, but by a high priest recounting years of struggle to restore order to a land that had, by his own account, fallen into what he calls years of confusion and fighting between factions who no longer recognized a single legitimate authority. This is one of the most detailed first-hand Egyptian accounts of internal rebellion to survive from any period of pharaonic history, and yet, remarkably, the conflict it describes remains only partially understood, its origins obscured despite the relative wealth of surviving testimony. We have traced foreign communities whose fates dissolved quietly into uncertainty. The story we turn to now involves no foreign threat at all, but something arguably more unsettling to Egypt's traditional self-image. A civil conflict erupting from within the country's own fractured political and religious establishment, during a period already characterized by the kind of divided competing authority that had first emerged in the aftermath of Herihor's strange assumption of royal trappings at the close of the New Kingdom. By the time of Takalot II's reign, generally dated to the 9th century BC, Egypt had entered what historians call the Third Intermediate Period, an era we touched on earlier through the Theban high priesthood's growing independence from royal authority in the Delta. This period was defined by exactly the kind of fragmented, overlapping authority that pattern first suggested, with Egypt effectively governed by multiple simultaneous power centers, various pharaohs of the 22nd dynasty ruling from Tanis and Bubastis in the north, while the high priests of Amun at Thebes maintained their own substantial regional authority in the south, an arrangement that had, by this point, persisted in various forms for well over a century, without producing the kind of full reunification that later periods of Egyptian history would eventually achieve. Into this already complex political landscape, Takalot II's reign introduces a conflict whose precise triggering cause the surviving sources describe only in broad, frustratingly general terms. The Chronicle of Prince Userkare, carved by Takalot II's own son, who held the position of High Priest of Amun during much of this turmoil, describes a rebellion breaking out in the region of Thebes, resulting in years of conflict severe enough to disrupt temple offerings and religious festivals. Actions considered catastrophic in a society that viewed the maintenance of proper ritual practice as essential to cosmic and political order alike. Userkare's account describes suppressing this rebellion, only for renewed conflict to erupt again later, suggesting a prolonged, recurring struggle rather than a single contained uprising, quickly resolved. What caused this rebellion in the first place? Userkare's own inscription offers surprisingly little direct explanation, framing the conflict largely in terms of restoring order and defeating what he characterizes as chaos and wrongdoing. Language that, while certainly suggestive of genuine unrest, provides historians with little concrete detail about the rebellion's underlying causes, its specific leadership, or the particular grievances that drove ordinary Thebans and, quite possibly, rival religious or political factions to take up arms against the established authority Userkare represented. The most widely proposed explanation connects this unrest to the broader tensions inherent in Egypt's divided Third Intermediate Period political structure. Takalot II, Chonu, ruling from the north, had appointed his own son, Userkare, to the powerful position of High Priest of Amun at Thebes, a move that may have been perceived locally as an unwelcome imposition of northern royal authority over a southern religious institution that had, for generations, developed its own traditions of relatively independent leadership. If local Theban families or officials had expected the high priesthood to remain within networks of southern influence, rather than being awarded to a prince dispatched from the rival northern court, resentment over this appointment alone might have provided sufficient grievance to spark organized resistance, particularly if it coincided with broader economic or administrative disputes about the balance of power and resources between Thebes and the northern capital. This reading finds some support in the specific individuals Userkare's chronicle identifies as opponents during the conflict, including references to rival claimants who appear to have positioned themselves, at various points, as alternative authorities within Thebes itself, suggesting the rebellion was not simply a matter of general lawlessness, but a genuine contest over legitimate religious and political leadership in the south, with real competing candidates for authority rather than an undirected uprising against Takalot II's rule in the abstract. A further complication, and one that has generated considerable scholarly speculation, involves questions about Takalot II's own legitimacy and background. Some historians have proposed that Takalot II may not have descended directly from the immediately preceding line of 22nd dynasty pharaohs in the way official inscriptions suggest, raising the possibility that his own claim to the northern throne carried genuine vulnerabilities that rival factions in Thebes may have recognized and sought to exploit, using resistance to his son's appointment as high priest as a broader vehicle for challenging Takalot II's overall legitimacy as ruler of a unified, if administratively divided, Egypt. Under this reading, the Theban rebellion becomes not merely a local dispute over religious appointment, but a proxy conflict touching on much larger, unresolved questions about who actually held rightful authority over Egypt during this fragmented period. Chronological confusion compounds these difficulties considerably. The Third Intermediate Period is notoriously difficult to date with precision, in part because multiple pharaohs and high priests across different regional power centers sometimes used overlapping or parallel regnal year systems, and in part because the fragmentary nature of surviving records from this era leaves considerable gaps in establishing exactly how various rulers' reigns aligned chronologically with one another. Some scholars have proposed that a figure identified in some records as a rival pharaoh named Pedubast may have emerged during this same period, potentially ruling simultaneously with Takhalat II from a competing power base, further complicating the political landscape Userkare describes navigating throughout the conflict. If Pedubast I represented not simply a local Theban rebel, but an entirely separate claimant to pharaonic legitimacy backed by his own network of regional supporters, the unrest Userkare chronicles begins to look less like a contained local uprising, and more like another chapter in the recurring pattern of divided, competing kingship that had already produced situations like the earlier civil war between Seti II and Amenmesse, examined earlier in this exploration, and would continue to characterize Egyptian politics throughout much of the Third Intermediate Period's duration. The eventual resolution of the conflict, as Userkare describes it, involved his own forces suppressing the rebellion and restoring what he characterizes as proper order and worship to Thebes, language that, as with so much of ancient Egyptian royal and priestly rhetoric, emphasizes triumphant restoration without providing the kind of granular detail modern historians would need to fully reconstruct the practical mechanics of how this resolution was actually achieved, what became of the rebellion's leadership, or whether the underlying tensions between northern royal authority and southern religious independence were genuinely resolved or simply suppressed temporarily, only to resurface again in the further political fragmentation that continued to characterize Egypt in the decades following Takhalat II's reign. Some researchers have suggested that this conflict, rather than representing an isolated episode, may be best understood as one visible flashpoint within a much longer, slower-moving struggle over the proper distribution of religious and political authority in Egypt, following the precedent Herihor had established generations earlier, a struggle that would continue in various forms until Egypt eventually fell under the control of a reunifying Kushite dynasty from the south, whose own rulers would need to navigate this same fundamental tension between northern and southern claims to legitimate authority over the whole of Egyptian territory. What remains, in the end, is one of ancient Egypt's more detailed first-hand accounts of internal rebellion, carved by a participant with every reason to describe events clearly and in his own favor, and yet still leaving modern historians without a fully satisfying explanation of what specifically ignited the conflict, who precisely led the opposition against Userkare's authority, or how completely the underlying tensions were actually resolved once the immediate fighting subsided. Was this rebellion fundamentally a local dispute over an unwelcome religious appointment, a Theban population resisting northern intrusion into their traditional institutions? Was it a proxy conflict reflecting deeper, unresolved questions about Takhalat II's own legitimacy as ruler of a divided Egypt? Or did it represent something closer to a genuine rival claim to pharaonic authority itself, embodied in a competing ruler whose own place in this chronology remains debated by scholars even now? The walls of Karnak preserve Prince Userkare's own proud account of victory, carved in his own words, meant to demonstrate his success in restoring order to a fractured land. What they do not preserve, despite their unusual length and detail, is a fully satisfying answer to why that order broke down so severely in the first place, or whether the fragile peace he describes achieving ultimately held for longer than the years it took for Egypt's underlying political divisions to reassert themselves once again. At the Temple of Jebel Barkal, deep in what is now Sudan, a massive granite stela records, in the voice of a Kushite king, the story of a conquest that reversed thousands of years of Egyptian assumptions about the direction power was supposed to flow along the Nile. The inscription, known to historians as the Victory Stela of Paye, describes a southern ruler marching north, defeating one Egyptian faction after another, and ultimately claiming dominion over the very land that had once built fortresses specifically to keep Kush contained beyond Egypt's southern frontier. It is one of the most detailed royal narratives to survive from ancient Africa, and yet the fuller conflict it represents, a prolonged and still only partially understood struggle between Egypt and Kush across much of the Third Intermediate Period, remains far less clear in its origins and earlier phases than this single triumphant document might suggest. We have followed Egypt's fractured internal politics through Takalot II's Theban rebellion and the recurring pattern of divided authority that plagued this era. But even as Egypt's own kings struggled against rival claimants within their own borders, a larger force was gathering strength along the southern frontier, one whose earlier stages of growth and conflict with Egypt remained frustratingly obscure, despite the eventual unmistakable clarity of its final outcome. Kush, centered in the region historians call Nubia, had a long and complicated relationship with Egypt stretching back millennia, from the fortress network of the Middle Kingdom we explored earlier, through periods of direct Egyptian colonization and cultural influence during the New Kingdom, when Nubia was governed closely enough by Egyptian administrators that its elite adopted Egyptian religious practices, burial customs, and even the worship of Amun himself, the same god whose Theban priesthood would later prove so central to Egypt's own internal fragmentation. This deep cultural entanglement makes the eventual reversal, Kush not merely gaining independence from Egyptian control, but eventually conquering Egypt outright, all the more historically significant, and all the more puzzling in its details. By the time Paye's stela was carved, generally dated to the 8th century BC, Kush had clearly developed into a powerful, centralized kingdom in its own right, ruling from a capital at Napata near the Fourth Cataract of the Nile, with sufficient military and administrative capacity to mount a sustained campaign deep into Egyptian territory. But how did Kush arrive at this position of strength? The transition from a region that had, centuries earlier, been directly administered by Egyptian officials to an independent kingdom capable of eventually conquering Egypt itself represents an enormous shift in the regional balance of power, and the specific stages of that shift remain only partially documented. The withdrawal of direct Egyptian administrative control over Nubia appears to have occurred gradually during the same broader collapse of centralized New Kingdom authority that produced Herihor's unusual assumption of royal trappings at Thebes. As Egypt's own political structure fragmented into competing power centers in the north and south, the resources and administrative attention required to maintain direct control over distant Nubian territories would have become increasingly difficult to sustain, mirroring, in some respects, the earlier Middle Kingdom fortress abandonment we examined previously, though occurring under quite different political circumstances centuries later. What filled this administrative vacuum, and how quickly, remains considerably less clear. Archaeological evidence suggests a period of apparent discontinuity in Nubia following the withdrawal of direct Egyptian control, sometimes described by researchers as a dark age in the region's own material record, before the emergence of a clearly identifiable centralized Kushite state at Napata becomes archaeologically visible. This gap has led some historians to characterize Kush's rise as a genuinely independent development, a local political consolidation occurring largely outside of, and initially unconnected to, ongoing events in Egypt itself. Others have proposed that the transition may have been considerably more continuous than the archaeological gap suggests, with elements of Egyptian-derived administrative and religious practice persisting locally even as direct Egyptian political control lapsed, providing an institutional foundation that later Kushite rulers built upon rather than developed entirely from scratch. The question of when, precisely, open conflict between Egypt and this resurgent Kushite kingdom actually began is where the mystery deepens most significantly. Paye's own stela describes a campaign already well underway by the time of its carving, referencing prior military activity and existing Kushite influence extending into portions of Upper Egypt before the specific campaign the inscription commemorates even begins. This suggests that Paye's dramatic northern conquest, rather than representing the opening move in a new conflict, may have been closer to a culminating campaign in a longer, less well-documented process of gradual Kushite expansion into Egyptian territory that had already been unfolding for some time before this particular stela was ever carved. If this reading is correct, an entire earlier phase of Egyptian-Kushite conflict may be missing from the detailed historical record entirely, its battles, its earlier Kushite rulers, and its gradual erosion of Egyptian authority in Upper Egypt occurring during years for which no comparably detailed royal narrative happens to survive. We are left glimpsing this earlier conflict only through its consequences, visible in the political landscape Paye's stela describes navigating, rather than through any direct account of how that landscape came to be so favorable to Kushite ambitions in the first place. The fragmented nature of Egypt's own 22nd and 23rd dynasty politics during this same period, the same recurring pattern of competing regional pharaohs and independent-minded Theban high priests we explored through Takalot II's rebellion, likely created exactly the kind of opportunity a rising external power could exploit. A unified Egypt, with strong centralized control over its own southern frontier, would have presented Kush with a far more formidable obstacle to expansion than the fractured, internally contested Egypt of this particular era, divided among multiple simultaneous claimants to pharaonic legitimacy, none of whom could necessarily count on unified military support from rival Egyptian factions to repel a coordinated southern threat. Paye's stela itself provides some of our clearest evidence for just how fragmented Egypt had become by the time of his campaign, describing a coalition of Egyptian rulers, including figures identified as kings and princes governing various Delta and Middle Egyptian territories, whom Paye's forces confronted and ultimately compelled to submit during his northern advance. This portrait of numerous simultaneous competing Egyptian authorities, rather than a single unified pharaoh commanding the country's full military resources, aligns closely with the broader pattern of division this exploration has traced repeatedly through the Third Intermediate Period, suggesting Kush's eventual conquest may have succeeded, in significant part, precisely because Egypt's own internal conflicts had already left it critically vulnerable to exactly this kind of external pressure. What remains uncertain, even after Paye's victory, is exactly how complete and lasting Kushite control over Egypt actually was following this campaign. Paye's own account describes accepting the submission of defeated Egyptian rulers, and then, notably, returning south to Napata rather than remaining in Egypt to govern directly, a decision some historians read as evidence that Paye's primary goals centered on securing tribute, religious legitimacy, and acknowledgement of Kushite supremacy, rather than establishing permanent, direct, administrative control over Egyptian territory. If true, this would mean that the conflict, rather than concluding with a clear, lasting conquest, may have instead settled into a more ambiguous arrangement, with various Egyptian rulers retaining significant local autonomy under a broader Kushite overlordship that later Kushite pharaohs would need to reassert and expand upon through further campaigns in the following decades before Kushite rule over Egypt became more fully consolidated, eventually establishing what historians recognize as the 25th dynasty. Some researchers have questioned whether this back-and-forth pattern, campaigns of conquest followed by apparent withdrawal and later renewed intervention, might reflect not indecision on Kush's part, but a genuinely different model of imperial authority than the more direct territorial control Egypt itself had once exercised over Nubia centuries earlier, an arrangement rooted in tribute, religious legitimacy through the shared worship of Amun, and periodic demonstrations of military supremacy rather than continuous direct administrative governance of Egyptian territory from a Kushite center of power. What ties this entire conflict together, and what continues to frustrate a fuller understanding of it, is the same fundamental problem this exploration has returned to repeatedly: an imbalance in surviving evidence, with Kush's own perspective, captured in monuments like Paye's stela, providing our clearest window into events that Egyptian sources from the same fractured competing power centers largely fail to describe with comparable detail or unified perspective. Did the war between Egypt and Kush begin decades before Paye's famous campaign, in conflicts too poorly documented to reconstruct with any confidence? Did Egypt's own internal fragmentation, the same pattern of competing rulers and regional independence traced throughout this exploration, create the specific conditions that allowed a once subordinate territory to eventually conquer the very civilization that had governed it centuries before? And how many earlier Kushite kings, whose names and campaigns never received the kind of lasting monumental commemoration Piye's stela achieved, might have laid the groundwork for a conquest that the historical record remembers as arriving suddenly, when its true origins may stretch back considerably further into a past this era's own historical silence has left largely unrecovered. The granite stela at Jebel Barkal still stands, its inscription confident and detailed about the campaign it commemorates, and almost entirely silent about everything that came before it. In the writings of the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, composed centuries after the events he describes, a brief and startling claim survives about the fate of an Egyptian king named Bokoris, a Hellenized rendering of the native name Bakenrenef, that he was captured by an invading Kushite ruler and burned alive. No Egyptian source makes this claim directly. No contemporary inscription describes the manner of his death at all. And yet this single dramatic assertion, filtered through a foreign historian writing long after the fact, has shaped much of the modern understanding of how the last independent native pharaoh of this troubled era actually met his end. We have followed Kush's rise from a subordinate southern territory to a conquering power capable of humbling Egypt's fractured rulers under Piye. The story we turn to now picks up in the campaign's aftermath, a generation or so later, when the uneasy settlement Piye left behind finally gave way to full Kushite conquest, and one Egyptian king's reign and reported death became caught in the middle of that final consolidation. Bakenranef ruled as the sole king of Egypt's 24th dynasty, based at Sais in the western Nile Delta, during a period generally dated to the mid-8th century BC, in the years following Piye's withdrawal back to Napata after his own campaign of conquest and submission. As we explored previously, Piye appears to have been content to accept tribute and acknowledgement of Kushite supremacy from Egypt's various regional rulers without establishing permanent, direct administrative control, a decision that left considerable local autonomy in place across Egypt's fractured political landscape. Bakenranef, whose father Tefnakht had been among the Delta rulers who submitted to Piye during that earlier campaign, inherited a kingdom that operated under this loose, tribute-based Kushite overlordship rather than direct occupation. What Bakenranef did with this inherited autonomy remains, in itself, a subject of some historical interest and uncertainty. Later Egyptian tradition remembered him as a lawgiver, associated with legal reforms concerning debt and property, and Greek sources, drawing on Egyptian material that has not otherwise survived, described him as a wise and notably pious ruler, a reputation that sits somewhat uneasily alongside the violent death later attributed to him. Was Bakenranef genuinely attempting to reassert stronger, more independent native Egyptian authority during his reign, testing the limits of the loose arrangement Piye had left in place? Or did he simply continue the same basic pattern of nominal submission his father had already established, governing his Delta territory much as before, while Kush's attention remained focused elsewhere? The answer to this question matters enormously for understanding what happened next, because Bakenranef's reign ended with the arrival of a new Kushite king, Piye's successor Shabaka, whose campaign into Egypt appears to have been considerably more thorough and decisive than his predecessors had been. Where Piye had accepted submission and tribute while allowing local rulers to remain largely in place, Shabaka's conquest resulted in the definitive establishment of direct Kushite rule over the whole of Egypt, inaugurating the fuller consolidation of the 25th dynasty that Piye's earlier campaign had only partially achieved. And somewhere within this transition, according to later tradition, Bakenranef died. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC, several centuries after these events, describes Bokoris as a king who was ultimately captured and executed by burning at the hands of the Ethiopian, meaning Kushite, king who conquered Egypt during this period. This account, brief as it is, represents essentially the only detailed description of the manner of Bakenranef's death to survive in any ancient source. No Egyptian monument, no contemporary Kushite inscription describes his fate directly. The silence from sources actually contemporary with the events themselves stands in notable contrast to the vivid, specific detail offered by a much later foreign historian working from sources modern scholars can no longer independently verify or trace. Why the discrepancy, and how much weight should Diodorus's account actually carry? The most cautious scholarly position treats this claim with considerable skepticism, noting that Greek historians writing about Egypt centuries after the fact frequently drew on garbled, second-hand, or even deliberately dramatized traditions that had traveled through multiple intermediary sources before reaching their final written form. Execution by burning, in particular, carried strong symbolic and narrative weight in various ancient literary traditions, and some historians have wondered whether this detail reflects an actual historical event, a later embellishment added to emphasize the completeness of Kushite triumph over a defeated native rival, or even a conflation with some entirely separate tradition or historical episode that became attached to Bakenranef's name through the long chain of transmission separating Diodorus from the events he describes. And yet the claim cannot be dismissed entirely as pure invention either. Diodorus, whatever the limitations of his sources, was working from earlier Greek and Egyptian material, some of it likely derived from Manetho's own history of Egypt, itself compiled by an Egyptian priest with access to native records and traditions that have not otherwise survived into the modern period. If Manetho's work, now lost except for fragments quoted by later authors including Diodorus, did in fact preserve some genuine Egyptian tradition regarding Bakenranef's violent death, that would lend the account considerably more credibility than a simple later Greek fabrication, even if we can no longer trace the claim back to its original Egyptian source with full confidence. This uncertainty leaves historians with a genuinely difficult interpretive choice. Accept the account, and Bakenranef's death becomes a dramatic, symbolically resonant end to native Egyptian rule in this period, a king burned alive by his Kushite conqueror as a demonstration of total, uncompromising victory, marking a much harsher transition than the relatively bloodless submission Piye had accepted from Bakenranef's own father a generation earlier. Reject or heavily qualify the account, and we are left with essentially no reliable information about how Bakenranef actually died at all, only the bare fact that his reign, and the independent 24th dynasty he represented, came to an end around the time of Shabaka's more thorough conquest of Egypt. Some historians have proposed a middle position, suggesting that even if the specific detail of execution by burning cannot be fully verified, the broader claim that Bakenranef died violently rather than peacefully or through natural causes, during or shortly after Shabaka's conquest remains plausible and consistent with the pattern of harsher, more direct consolidation Shabaka appears to have pursued compared to Piye's earlier, more restrained approach. Under this reading, the precise manner of death recorded by Diodorus might be embellished or uncertain in its specific details, while still reflecting a genuine underlying historical reality that Bakenranef's reign ended not through peaceful transition or continued local rule under Kushite tribute, but through direct, violent removal, as Shabaka moved to eliminate remaining native claims to independent authority in the Delta. This would align with what little other evidence survives regarding the transition between these two dynasties. Unlike Piye's campaign, which left detailed contemporary Kushite inscriptions describing the submission of various Egyptian rulers in considerable, almost celebratory detail, Shabaka's own conquest is documented in comparatively sparse fashion, leaving historians without the kind of rich first-hand Kushite perspective that made reconstructing Piye's earlier campaign, however incomplete, still considerably more detailed than what survives from this subsequent phase of consolidation. Why might Shabaka have left behind less detailed commemoration of his own conquest, even as he achieved a more complete and lasting political outcome than his predecessor? Some researchers have speculated that Shabaka's priorities, once secure on the throne, shifted more heavily toward presenting himself as a legitimate, traditional Egyptian pharaoh integrated into existing religious and administrative structures, rather than continuing to emphasize the specifically military, conquest-focused narrative that had characterized Piye's own self-presentation. Under this reading, the relative silence surrounding the details of Bakenranef's fall and death might reflect a deliberate choice by Shabaka's own court to minimize emphasis on the violence of the transition, in favor of a smoother narrative of restored, legitimate Kushite Egyptian rule, a choice that would have left later Greek historians like Diodorus dependent on other, less official channels of tradition, however garbled those channels may have become over the centuries, separating him from the actual events. What remains in the end is a king remembered by later tradition for wisdom and legal reform, whose actual death is attested primarily through a single dramatic claim from a source writing centuries after the fact, unsupported by any surviving contemporary Egyptian or Kushite record, yet not definitively contradicted by one either. Did Bakenranef genuinely die by fire at Shabaka's order, a deliberate, symbolically calculated demonstration of total Kushite triumph over the last independent claimed native Egyptian kingship in this period? Did some other, less dramatic fate actually befall him, later transformed through generations of retelling into the vivid image Diodorus eventually recorded? Or does the truth lie somewhere in between, a genuinely violent end whose precise details have simply been lost to the same gaps in contemporary documentation that have obscured so much of this transitional period throughout our exploration? No tomb confirmed as Bakenranef's own has been definitively identified. No inscription in his own voice describes his final days. What survives is a reputation for wisdom, a single foreign historian's dramatic claim about his death, and a silence from Egypt's own contemporary sources that neither confirms nor denies the fire Diodorus insists once claimed the last king of an independent Delta dynasty. On the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, in the rugged hillside necropolis known as El Tarif, a series of massive rock-cut tombs called the Saf tombs stretch in long rows across the desert slope, their facades cut directly into the cliff in a style unlike almost any other royal burial in Egyptian history. One of these tombs belonged to a king named Intef III, a ruler whose reign helped lay the groundwork for Egypt's eventual reunification after the fractured chaos of the First Intermediate Period, and whose death, like so much of his brief and poorly documented rule, remains almost entirely unexplained by any source that has survived into the present. We have followed the violent, contested ending of Egypt's last native Delta dynasty under Bakenranef. We travel now much further back in time, to an earlier period of division this exploration touched on previously, the fractured aftermath of the Old Kingdom's 6th dynasty collapse, and to one of the lesser documented rulers whose reign helped gradually to pull Egypt back toward unity from that earlier era of competing regional powers. Intef III ruled during the 11th dynasty, in the years generally dated to the early 21st century BC, as part of a line of Theban rulers whose family had spent roughly a century building up regional strength in Upper Egypt, gradually positioning themselves as the dominant power capable of eventually challenging and absorbing the rival kingdom based at Heracleopolis in the north. This slow generational project of reunification, which would ultimately succeed under Intef III's son and successor Mentuhotep II, generally credited as the ruler who finally reunified Egypt and inaugurated the Middle Kingdom, depended heavily on the foundation laid by his immediate predecessors, including Intef III himself. And yet, despite occupying this genuinely pivotal position in Egyptian history, a direct ancestor of the king, who would go on to reunify the entire country, Intef III himself remains one of the more obscure figures in this critical transitional period, his reign documented through only a handful of surviving inscriptions, and the circumstances of his death recorded nowhere at all in any text that has survived to the present day. What we can reconstruct of his reign comes primarily from a small number of monuments and later king lists, which suggest a relatively brief rule, estimated by most historians at somewhere between 7 and 9 years, sandwiched between the more extensively documented reign of his father, Intef II, whose own tomb stela survives in reasonably good condition and describes decades of successful military and political consolidation in Upper Egypt, and the far better attested reign of his son Mentuhotep II, whose eventual triumph over the rival Heracleopolitan kingdom would transform this entire family's regional project into the reunification of Egypt as a whole. This positioning, a relatively brief, thinly documented reign wedged between two considerably more prominent and better recorded rulers, immediately raises an obvious question. Was Intef III's short reign simply the natural result of ascending the throne relatively late in life, ruling only a handful of years before dying of what may have been entirely ordinary causes related to age or illness, exactly the kind of unremarkable death that would leave little impression on a historical record already thin for this period? Or does the brevity and obscurity of his reign suggest something less straightforward, a ruler who faced challenges to his authority significant enough to shorten his reign, or whose death involved circumstances his own successors had reason not to commemorate in the kind of detail we find in the surviving records of his father and son? The mainstream position among most Egyptologists leans toward the more mundane explanation. Ancient Egyptian sources rarely commemorate a king's specific cause of death regardless of the actual circumstances involved, reserving surviving monumental inscriptions primarily for celebrating military victories, religious dedications, and administrative achievements rather than providing anything resembling a modern obituary. Under this reading, Intef III's death simply falls into the same broad category as the vast majority of ancient Egyptian royal deaths. Undocumented not because anything unusual occurred, but because documenting the specific manner and circumstances of a king's death was simply never standard practice in the kinds of inscriptions that have survived from this period. And yet certain details surrounding Intef III's reign and its aftermath have led some historians to consider more speculative possibilities, even while acknowledging the extremely limited evidence available to evaluate them. One area of interest involves the succession itself. Mentuhotep II, who followed his father onto the throne, went on to rule for approximately 50 years, an extraordinarily long reign that saw the eventual military reunification of Egypt achieved only after years of continued conflict with the rival Heracleopolitan kingdom in the north, conflict that appears to have still been very much unresolved at the time Intef III's own brief reign came to an end. Some scholars have wondered whether Intef III's death, whatever its actual cause, occurred at a genuinely precarious moment in this ongoing struggle for reunification, with the Theban kingdom's fortunes against its northern rival still very much undecided, raising the question of whether a sudden, unexpected royal death during an active military campaign or period of heightened political tension might have carried different implications than a death occurring during a more settled, secure period of a king's reign. This line of speculation remains, it must be emphasized, built almost entirely on inference from broader context rather than any direct evidence specific to Intef III's own death. No inscription describes a military setback, a health crisis, or any specific event coinciding with the end of his reign. We know his reign was brief. We know it fell within a broader period of ongoing conflict his family had been engaged in for generations. Beyond these two established facts, any connection between the timing of his death and the state of that ongoing struggle remains speculative reconstruction rather than documented history. A further complication involves the physical evidence, or rather, the persistent uncertainty surrounding it, connected to Intef III's own burial. While his Saf tomb at El Tarif has been identified through inscriptional evidence associating the site with his name and titles, the tomb itself, like others of this style and period, has suffered extensively from millennia of exposure, later reuse, and in some cases deliberate quarrying of stone for later construction projects, leaving archaeologists with only a fragmentary understanding of the tomb's original contents and condition. No confirmed mummy of Intef III has been identified with the kind of certainty that would allow modern forensic examination to shed any direct light on the cause of his death. A gap that stands in notable contrast to later periods of Egyptian history, where royal mummies recovered from caches like the one at Deir el-Bahari have allowed researchers to draw at least some physical conclusions about the health, injuries, or manner of death of various New Kingdom pharaohs. This absence of physical evidence leaves Intef III's death firmly in the territory of historical silence, rather than active mystery in the more dramatic sense we have explored elsewhere in this journey, a category distinct from, say, the debated details of Bakenrenef's fiery end, where at least one source offers a specific, if uncertain, claim to evaluate. Here, There is no claim to evaluate at all, only an absence so complete that even speculation struggles to find much surface to grip. And yet this very completeness of silence carries its own kind of significance within the broader story of Egypt's reunification. Intef III stands as a genuinely transitional figure, inheriting a regional kingdom already strong and ambitious under his father's leadership, and passing that kingdom on to a son who would complete the project of reunification his family had pursued for generations. Whatever happened during his own brief years on the throne, whatever combination of ordinary mortality or unrecorded crisis actually ended his reign, the broader project his family had committed itself to continued forward essentially uninterrupted, suggesting that whatever circumstances surrounded his death, they did not meaningfully derail the momentum his father had built and his son would ultimately bring to completion. Some historians have found in this continuity itself a kind of quiet argument for the more mundane explanation of his death, reasoning that a genuinely destabilizing royal crisis, whether military defeat, internal succession dispute, or sudden unexpected death under suspicious circumstances, might reasonably be expected to leave some trace of disruption in the broader historical and archaeological record of this transitional period, some evidence of delayed campaigns, contested succession, or interrupted administrative continuity. The absence of any such disruption, under this reading, suggests a relatively smooth, unremarkable transition from Intef III to Mentuhotep II, consistent with an ordinary royal death rather than anything more dramatic. Others caution that the same thinness of documentation that leaves us without details of Intef III's death might equally leave us unable to detect even a genuine crisis if the surviving record for this period is simply too fragmentary to register disruptions that, in a better documented era, would have left clearer traces behind. Under this more cautious reading, the absence of evidence for a crisis cannot be treated as confident evidence of its absence, only as a reflection of how little survives from this transitional period at all. What remains, in the end, is a king whose reign helped position his family for the reunification of Egypt, whose tomb still stands, weathered and diminished, among the long rock-cut facades of El Tarif, and whose death, unlike so many of the mysteries this exploration has traced, offers historians not competing theories to weigh against one another, but something closer to a genuine void, a space in the record where an explanation should exist, and simply does not. Was Intef III's death as unremarkable as the silence surrounding it suggests? An ordinary passing quietly absorbed into his family's larger, ultimately triumphant project of reunification? Or did something happen during those brief 7 to 9 years on the throne that his own successors, for reasons we can no longer access, chose never to commit to any surviving stone? The Saf tombs of El Tarif keep whatever answer they might once have held in the same silence that has surrounded this king for over 4,000 years. On a fragment of limestone known as the Abydos King List, carved centuries after the events it records, a long column of royal names marches down the stone in careful hieroglyphic order, compiled by priests of Seti I as a ritual offering list honoring the kings who had come before him. Most of these names correspond to rulers whose reigns can be cross-checked against other inscriptions, tombs, and monuments scattered across Egypt. And then, tucked within a stretch of the list corresponding to one of the most poorly understood periods in all of Egyptian history, appears a name that exists, for all practical purposes, nowhere else. Neferirkare II. We have just traced the near-total silence surrounding Intef III's death, a king whose life we can at least partially reconstruct, even without knowing how it ended. The mystery of Neferirkare II represents something more extreme still, a ruler whose very existence survives almost entirely as a single line in a list, a name without a reign, without a tomb, without a single confirmed monument to anchor him in the physical world he supposedly once governed. Neferirkare II belongs, according to the Abydos King List's positioning, to the transitional period following the collapse of the Old Kingdom's centralized authority, the same broad era of fragmentation we explored earlier through the sudden fall of the 6th dynasty elite. This period, encompassing what Egyptologists generally refer to as the 7th and 8th dynasties, stands as perhaps the single most obscure stretch of documented Egyptian history. A span of years, possibly only a few decades, possibly closer to a century, during which the Memphite throne appears to have passed through an extraordinarily rapid succession of kings, many of whom are known, like Nefertari II, from nothing more than a name preserved in later king list traditions. The ancient historian Manetho, whose work survives only through fragments quoted by later authors, offered a description of this period that has become almost proverbial among Egyptologists for capturing its sheer instability. He reportedly claimed that 70 kings ruled Egypt in the span of 70 days, a figure modern historians treat not as literal fact, but as a kind of ancient shorthand for chaos, an acknowledgement that the succession during this window had become so rapid, so fragmented, that even later Egyptian tradition itself struggled to make coherent sense of exactly how many rulers had actually held the throne, or for how long any of them had genuinely governed. Within this chaotic stretch, Nefertari II's name appears, offering us confirmation that a king by this name was, at some point, considered legitimate enough to include in later commemorative king lists, without providing any further detail about who he actually was, how he came to power, how long he ruled, or what became of him. No pyramid has been confidently attributed to his reign. No administrative document bears his name. No tomb, no seal, no fragment of temple relief has been identified with sufficient confidence to say definitively that this object, this inscription, this structure belonged to this particular king, rather than to any of the numerous other shadowy Memphite rulers whose names populate this same troubled stretch of the record. Why does this matter, beyond the simple frustration of an unanswered historical question? Because Nefertari II's near-total absence from the physical record raises a genuinely difficult interpretive problem that extends well beyond his individual case. If a king can appear in a later, ostensibly reliable royal list, yet leave behind no corroborating physical evidence whatsoever, what does that tell us about the reliability of the list itself for this particular stretch of Egyptian history? Was Nefertari II a genuine, if extremely short-lived ruler who controlled at least some portion of Egypt during this fractured period, his physical monument simply lost to the same instability and lack of resources that likely limited his reign's duration and ambitions in the first place? Or does his appearance on the list reflect something more complicated, a name preserved through later scribal tradition that may have become detached from any clear historical reality by the time Seti I's priests compiled their commemorative record centuries afterward, confusing or conflating this period's genuinely chaotic succession with names whose original context had already become uncertain even to ancient compilers working with whatever fragmentary records survived into their own time? The mainstream scholarly position generally treats names like Nefertari II's as reflecting genuine, if genuinely obscure, historical rulers, reasoning that later Egyptian king list compilers, working directly for a state deeply invested in maintaining accurate ritual continuity with legitimate royal ancestors, had strong institutional incentive to include only names understood in their own time as authentic prior kings, rather than inventing fictional rulers to pad out an already confusing period. Under this reading, Nefertari II genuinely sat upon Egypt's throne, however briefly, however limited his actual territorial control may have been during a period when centralized Memphite authority had already substantially eroded, and the absence of corroborating physical evidence reflects nothing more than the ordinary expected pattern of loss for any short-reigned, resource-poor ruler governing during a genuinely chaotic transitional era, rather than any deeper problem with his historical authenticity. But this confidence in the list's accuracy runs into its own complications when we consider how thoroughly this particular period seems to have generated confusion even among ancient Egyptian scribes themselves. Manetho's own account of 70 kings in 70 days, whatever its precise original meaning, at minimum signals that even historians working many centuries closer to these events than we are today already regarded this stretch of Egyptian history as difficult to reconstruct with confidence. if ancient compilers themselves struggled to maintain clear, reliable records of exactly who ruled during this period and for how long. Modern historians working with only fragments of fragments have correspondingly less basis for confident certainty about any individual name preserved from this era, including Neferirkare II's. Some researchers have proposed that names like this may represent genuine historical figures whose reigns were so brief, so limited in territorial scope, and so poorly integrated into any centralized administrative record-keeping that even contemporary Egyptians outside their immediate court would have had only limited awareness of their existence, let alone later generations working from whatever fragmentary written or oral tradition managed to survive the intervening centuries before someone finally compiled a list like the one honored at Abydos. Under this reading, we should not necessarily expect to find corroborating physical evidence for every name preserved in such lists, precisely because the underlying reality they reflect was itself a period so fractured that leaving behind lasting monuments may have been logistically impossible for many of the individuals who briefly held some claim to the throne. Others have wondered whether certain names surviving only in later king lists might actually reflect not individual historical kings at all, but garbled memories of other figures, regional officials whose local authority became inflated or misremembered as full kingship by the time later tradition recorded them, or even duplicated or slightly corrupted versions of names belonging to other, better attested rulers from adjacent periods. Errors introduced somewhere along the long chain of transmission separating the actual chaotic events of the 7th and 8th dynasties from Seti the Wern's priests compiling their commemorative list many centuries later. This remains speculative, difficult to prove or disprove definitively given how little independent evidence exists to test such theories against. But it represents a genuine possibility scholars continue to weigh when evaluating names from this particularly obscure stretch of the record. What makes Neferirkare II's case a fitting close to this pattern we have traced repeatedly throughout Egypt's long history of kings partially erased, contested, or genuinely forgotten is the sheer purity of the uncertainty involved. Userkare, whom we examined earlier in this exploration, at least left behind a handful of seals and official references beyond his appearance in king lists. Amenmesse left behind reworked tombs and deliberately damaged inscriptions testifying to a genuine, contested struggle for power. Even Intif III, despite the silence surrounding his death, left behind an identified tomb and a documented place within a well-attested royal lineage. Neferirkare II offers historians almost nothing beyond the name itself, a bare assertion of kingship preserved through a chain of transmission we cannot fully verify, describing a reign whose length, achievements, and very historical reality remain, even now, matters of careful scholarly inference rather than confirmed fact. Did Neferirkare II genuinely sit upon Egypt's fractured throne for some brief, forgotten span during one of its most chaotic periods, his monuments lost entirely to the same instability that likely limited his reign in the first place? Or does his name preserve something closer to an echo, a fragment of memory whose original historical substance became obscured long before any surviving record could capture it with clarity? The Abydos king list offers his name and nothing more, a single line among many honoring kings whose reigns priests centuries later still felt obligated to remember, even when, as in this case, remembering may have been all that ultimately survived. In the Wadi Hammamat, a dry desert valley cutting through the eastern mountains between the Nile and the Red Sea, ancient quarrying expeditions left behind hundreds of inscriptions carved directly into the rock face, brief records of officials sent to extract stone under the authority of a reigning king. Among these scattered texts, dating to the same turbulent stretch of Egyptian history we explored through the near-total obscurity of Neferirkare II, appears the name of another king from this same chaotic period, one whose royal decree survives in unusually specific detail, even as almost everything else about his reign and his eventual fate remains entirely unknown. His name was Userkare. Where Neferirkare II offered us barely more than a name on a later commemorative list, Userkare presents historians with a stranger kind of puzzle, a ruler attested through a genuine contemporary document, a royal decree preserved on stone that grants us a small, specific window into an act of governance from his reign, while leaving the broader context of that reign, its length, its scope, and above all its ending, almost entirely in shadow. The decree in question, generally known to Egyptologists through its associated find, records Userkare granting exemptions or protections to a specific individual or institution, the kind of administrative act that appears throughout Egyptian history in various forms. Kings using their authority to reward loyal officials, protect temple property, or establish specific legal privileges for favored subjects. This type of document tells us something genuinely valuable, that Userkare functioned as a recognized royal authority capable of issuing decrees that carried enough weight to be inscribed and presumably respected, at least within whatever portion of Egypt his authority actually extended over during this fractured period. But a single decree, however specific its content, cannot tell us how long Userkare's reign lasted, how he came to the throne in the first place, whether his authority extended across a genuinely unified Egypt, or, as seems more likely given the broader instability of this era, over only a limited territory around Memphis or some other regional power base. Nor, critically, what eventually happened to end his reign and remove him from the succession that Manetho's later tradition remembered as passing through so many rulers so rapidly during this general period. This combination, genuine contemporary evidence confirming a real reign, paired with almost total silence regarding everything beyond the narrow content of a single surviving document, places Userkare in a genuinely distinctive position among the many obscure rulers of Egypt's first intermediate period. He is not, like Neferkare II, a name whose very historical reality depends entirely on trust in a much later commemorative list. His existence is independently confirmed through a document created during his own actual reign. And yet this firmer footing in terms of basic historical existence brings us barely any closer to understanding the actual arc of his life and rule, or the circumstances of whatever ended it. The mainstream scholarly reconstruction of this period generally treats rulers like Userkare as representing one of several competing, often short-lived Memphite kings attempting to maintain some version of centralized royal authority, even as the practical reach and power of that authority contracted dramatically compared to the Old Kingdom's earlier centuries. Under this reading, Userkare's decree represents exactly the kind of act we might expect from a king still attempting to exercise traditional royal functions, protecting property, rewarding loyal officials, even as the broader infrastructure that had once supported such authority across the entirety of Egypt had already substantially eroded. His reign's end, under this interpretation, most likely came through the same basic pattern affecting most rulers of this chaotic era: displacement by a rival claimant, whether through outright conflict or simply the gradual transfer of whatever regional loyalty had originally supported his position, in a political environment where no single king appears to have possessed the resources or authority to establish anything resembling a lasting, secure dynasty. This explanation, while plausible and consistent with the broader pattern of instability this period clearly involved, remains almost entirely inferential, built from general knowledge of the era's chaotic character, rather than any specific evidence describing what actually happened to Userkare himself. We have, in essence, a single confirmed fact that he ruled and issued at least one royal decree, surrounded by an almost complete absence of any further information that would allow us to move from general period-appropriate speculation toward anything resembling a confirmed, specific account of his actual fate. Some researchers have attempted to extract additional inference from the location and content of the Wadi Hammamat inscription itself, noting that continued royal interest in this remote desert quarrying region during a period of apparent political fragmentation might suggest Userkare's authority, however limited its overall territorial reach, retained enough administrative capacity to organize and authorize expeditions to genuinely distant locations well beyond the Nile Valley's immediate settled territory. This detail, while modest, has led some to propose that Userkare's kingdom, whatever its precise boundaries, may have possessed somewhat more genuine administrative continuity and reach than the very briefest, most shadowy rulers of this era, whose names survive only through later king lists, without any comparable contemporary documentation of actual governmental activity. Others caution against reading too much stability into a single desert inscription, noting that quarrying expeditions, particularly to sites like Wadi Hammamat that had been utilized by Egyptian rulers for centuries before this period of fragmentation began, might have continued through momentum, established local knowledge, and existing infrastructure connecting the Nile Valley to this particular desert route, rather than necessarily reflecting the kind of robust, centrally coordinated administrative capacity that similar expeditions would have represented during more stable periods of Egyptian history. A single successful expedition, under this more cautious reading, tells us that Wajkare's authority was sufficient to organize this specific undertaking, without necessarily confirming anything more expansive about the overall strength, duration, or ultimate stability of his broader reign. The question of Wajkare's precise chronological position relative to other shadowy rulers of this same general period, including Neferkare II, and the broader chaos Manetho attempted, however imprecisely, to characterize through his account of 70 kings in 70 days, remains itself a matter of ongoing scholarly debate. Establishing reliable relative chronology for this era depends heavily on the same fragmentary king list traditions, whose own reliability we questioned in examining Neferkare II's case, leaving historians without a fully confident framework for determining whether Wajkare's reign preceded, followed, or perhaps even briefly overlapped with the various other obscure claimants whose names populate this same troubled stretch of Egyptian succession. What might have caused Wajkare's reign to end, whenever precisely it did? The range of possibilities available to historians attempting to reconstruct this period largely mirrors the broader patterns of instability already explored throughout this chaotic era. Military defeat at the hands of a rival regional claimant, the gradual erosion of loyalty among officials and local governors who had initially supported his authority, economic pressures potentially connected to the same kind of Nile flood irregularities. Some researchers have proposed contributed to the broader 6th dynasty collapse we examined earlier in this journey, or simply an ordinary death, whether from illness, age, or some other natural cause, followed by a succession crisis that saw his authority pass, contested or otherwise, to whichever rival claimant possessed sufficient local support to press forward with their own competing bid for recognition as Egypt's legitimate king. None of these explanations can currently be confirmed as the specific cause of Wajkare's own reign coming to its end. Each remains a reasonable possibility drawn from the broader context of an era we understand only in its general contours, applied to an individual ruler about whom we possess remarkably little specific information beyond the bare fact of his authority to issue at least one surviving decree. What the Wadi Hammamat inscription ultimately offers us, then, is not a solved mystery, but a particularly clear illustration of the peculiar evidentiary gap running throughout this entire chaotic period of Egyptian history. Genuine confirmation that specific, individually named kings truly did exercise real royal authority, however limited its territorial scope, paired with almost total silence regarding the human stories, the conflicts, the specific rises and falls that must have accompanied a period later Egyptian tradition remembered, however imprecisely, as one of the most fractured and chaotic stretches in the entire span of pharaonic history. Did Wajkare's reign end through violent displacement by a stronger rival, his authority simply overwhelmed by competing claimants in an era that offered no lasting security to any single ruler? Did economic or environmental pressures beyond any king's control undermine whatever local support had originally sustained his position? Or did he simply die as any ruler eventually must, his throne passing, peacefully or otherwise, into hands whose own subsequent fate would prove just as difficult for later generations to reconstruct with any confidence? The rock walls of Wadi Hammamat preserve his decree in careful, deliberate hieroglyphs, a genuine fragment of governance from a reign whose beginning, middle, and end otherwise remain almost entirely beyond our reach. 4,500 years after a king briefly held enough authority to leave this single, isolated trace of his rule carved into the desert stone,